1, 2.
Guide to stay on, so that I think there'll still be a lot of contestation. Wherever there's power, there's so the conference didn't resolve. It resolved some of the issues, but yeah. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
You can just catch my eye. I'll let you know when.
Paul's the man. Paul will be master of ceremonies. Huh? So,
I'm the MC all day for my
the minister.
many sins.
The minister's ready.
The minister's ready.
No, not yet. Not yet. He's not here. So I will let you know when he is.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
So did you meet here?
Which is
At least in the same room.
I wonder if I got a feeling we've met previously.
It's still in Bosch.
Yes.
There was an event with the Council of Law. It was about new constitutionalism.
Yeah.
That was 4 years ago.
4 years ago.
I guess we had a chat outside. Was
Yeah.
your wife before? Was your wife there?
She might well have been.
I think you
Yeah.
met your wife as well.
Yeah.
Phones on silent. Yes.
Just one question. Is this light in your face? Okay.
That one?
Should we?
I think it's okay.
Right, let's go. It's 9 o'clock. I'm ruthless. Are we up and going? Good morning, everybody, including those who are watching in cyberspace, those who are stuck in the traffic, and those who are having difficulty finding their way to the moot court. Those coming in at the back are welcome to join the happy throng. The more people, the merrier. We have a fully booked live audience of 55 people. And for reasons of COVID, we'd like to keep it that way. If you find yourself coughing and spluttering, we will supply you with a quick vaccination and a mask. I haven't heard anybody cough or splutter yet, so we should be all right on that front. As regards the virtual audience, I'm pleased to say that by last evening, 365 people have registered to attend in cyberspace. This is something that we got used to during the pandemic, and it is something that makes this kind of event far more penetrative than was the case both before and during COVID. So a special welcome to those who are attending in cyberspace. We started promptly at 9 because we are mindful of the fact that you are sitting at home and you are not challenged with getting to UCT on time and that sort of thing. We are going to try to stick to time as best we can. Just on the housekeeping front, and Chris will help me when I forget things on this front. The first thing to do is to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Primerio for putting their hands in their pockets to make this event possible, and to thank UCT for making this venue, this wonderful venue, available to us free of charge. As regards the opening session, Minister Lamola has been called away to an urgent meeting in Pretoria. I wonder what they're discussing. And he will be participating in cyberspace. I think he will be, is he already on the line? Not yet. Okay, he may be called away completely rather than just called away. But what we are going to do then, when the logistics are sorted out, is ask Gregor Jaka to welcome you on behalf of CAS, and Professor Firoz Kichalia, who is the chair of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, to each take up about 10 minutes of our time in setting the scene for a conference which concentrates on the words of Oliver Tambo. That's why we're in the Tambo moot court. We hear him speak in 1993 of the need not to rest until freedom and peace reign in the land. That thought has been modified or refined over time. What we talk about at Accountability Now is peace that is secure, progress that is sustainable, and prosperity that is shared. PS, 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 a postscript to the words of Oliver Tambo that you will find on the program of this event. From the sublime to the ridiculous, the men's toilet is as close to Nursery Gorge as you can get without leaving this building. It is to the left out of the front exit, and for the ladies is on the fire escape that leads down to the common room, which is 1 floor below, 25 stairs, and we will be having tea there at 11 and lunch there when the second panel, the whistleblowing panel, is finished. Please switch off your phones if you can, or put them on silent if you can't. And the same applies to any other devices, because you will spoil the fun of the 365 plus people who are with us in cyberspace. As regards the content of this program, everybody has seen the brochure that came out. We, in 8 words, we're implementing Glenister, we're protecting whistleblowers, we're introducing non-trial resolutions, and that's in corruption matters, obviously, and we are advancing the cause of the International Anti-Corruption Court. We think that these 4 topics are the cutting-edge topics, and little remains for me to say at this stage other than to welcome Professor Kachar. Well, let's start with a host. Gregor, you have your 10 minutes starting now. I wonder how I switch this on.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, Member of Parliament Muller, Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Minister of Parliament Breitenbach, Shadow Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Professor Kachalia, Chairperson of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, Archbishop Makoba of the Anglican Church, Justice Goldstone, former Judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, Judge Ian Farlam, former Judge of the Supreme Court of Appeal, Professor Fikeni, Chairperson of the Public Service Commission, distinguished speakers and guests here and online. Seldom has there been an opportunity to greet such a collection of eminent speakers and an eminent audience in one place. I welcome you to today's series of conversations in the name of the cooperation partners, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Primerio International, Accountability Now, and the University of Cape Town. It is my honor to open today's proceedings on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, named after the first Chancellor of Germany, Konrad Adenauer, in whose time the German Constitution was written. Its implementation is a key reason for the social recovery of Germany after the horrors inflicted during the Second World War. South Africa's constitution took much from it and carries exactly the same potential. The rule of law is directly linked to the health of a nation. Please allow me to say a few words about the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. As a think tank closely allied to the German CDU party of former Chancellor Angela Merkel, we promote democracy, good governance, human rights, and the rule of law through more than 100 offices worldwide. We foster dialogue between policymakers, actors from the private sector, and civil society. By bringing together people who embrace their societal responsibility, we promote the establishment of professional networks and the exchange of innovative ideas to tackle current challenges. Our work relies on strong local partners that share our values. I would like to therefore mention the excellent cooperation with our hosts, the University of Cape Town, in particular the DGRU, African Lee, and Law Stat Africa, that sit in the Faculty of Law. In the last 3 years, they have developed with our support an app that makes the Constitution more accessible for members of Parliament, and that will be advertised to the legal fraternity and general public shortly. You can find it by Googling Constitution Compass UCT. The app is available in English, isiXhosa, and isiZulu for the present, and contains an updated and consolidated version of the South African Constitution, accompanied by guides and constitutional case summaries. These are written in a non-technical and non-partisan language by graduate law students and supervised by UCT law lecturers and professors. I cannot applaud UCT enough for its great work. I recently arrived in South Africa from previous assignments in Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Iraq. Each of these have revealed different phases of corruption and the dangers of weak criminal justice administrations. And while I'm a supporter of federalism, in Kenya, I saw how a devolution program led to the dispersion of corruption from the political center to many counties due to a lack of anti-corruption measures. While I'm a supporter of the market economy and international trade, in DRC, I experienced how a country blessed by God with endless riches of mineral resources, nevertheless, is one of the poorest societies with high infant mortality due to corrupt political elites colluding with international companies. And finally, while I'm a supporter of international development cooperation for reconstruction, in Iraq I saw how reconstruction and the unleashing of large amount of investment led to an orgy of corruption due to a lack of a functioning justice system. To cut a long story short, corruption is an international sickness that eats our future and therefore eats our children. Without a functioning criminal justice system, the fundamental characteristic of corruption is escalation, both horizontally through the public and private sector and vertically from the very top of society to the very bottom. And much like mineral resources attract international investment, societies with weak criminal justice systems attract international specialists in corruption. Political oligarchs and corruption enablers that will steal one's country. And this is not abstract, it is personal. One may live one's own life with integrity, but a failure to fight corruption actively will bring violence such as assassination and kidnapping into one's own life. It is not something that can be appeased, and patience does not contain it. And given these reflections, I would like to say on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that we welcome today's event as an opportunity for South Africa to develop its own solution to corruption that light the way for the international community. It would not be the first time, given the miracle of South Africa's peaceful transition from apartheid. It is now a society that honors inherent human dignity, human rights, and seeks the achievement of equality through checks and balances on the exercise of power. I look very much forward to today's conversations, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Gregor, and my apologies for my inability to silence my laptop. It sits at home and nobody complains when it makes a noise there. I'm pleased to say that Minister Lamola is, please, Mr. Moderator, come in and take a seat. There he comes from the back. How's your team on the front, Judge? They're ready and briefed and waiting for you. Thank you. Minister Lamola is standing by in cyberspace, I think, or shortly will be. But in the meantime, let me call, and we must thank Crispin Piri for all of the hard work that he's done in order to get the minister, if not in the room, at least with us in cyberspace. I think that the time is best used by calling upon Professor Kachalia. I don't know how far away he is. That's the trouble. He's up. He's on. He is on. Thanks. Right. Thank you. Over to you, Professor.
Is it unmuted?
seems that the minister would like to go first, so let's unmute him and allow him to join. Minister, welcome to our conference. The line is unmuted and everybody is waiting expectantly to hear your input of 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me clearly. All distinguished guests at the conference, leaders of civil society, academia, the legal profession, and religious and faith group organizations, and all conference attendees. It is a great pleasure to participate in this conference and at this time in our country. A gathering of this nature is indicative of the fact that there is general consensus that corruption cannot be addressed by government alone or any type of services to the people of South Africa. Civil society, the private sector, and academia as a collective with government can be instrumental in effecting service delivery and fighting corruption in our country. As we gather here today, we are giving effect to the phrase democracy in action. We may not necessarily agree on certain aspects, but I do think that it is crucially important for us to look at the challenges we face from various perspectives. As government, we are now in a position to act on the recommendations of the Judicial Commission into the allegations of state capture, corruption, and fraud in the public sector. I'm pleased to highlight a few areas where significant progress has been made to date. And this obviously will lead to ongoing debates in society and to the shape of our democracy and of our various institutions. The National Prosecuting Authority and the Investigative Directorates have made significant progress in their renewal program. The reinstatement of the Aspirant Prosecutors Program has seen the reinvigoration of the NPA countrywide, and more than 1,000 new employees have been brought into the fold over the past 3 years through the Aspirant Prosecutor Program that has been reinstated to recapacitate and recalibrate the National Prosecuting Authority. One of the weak points which have been identified in the criminal justice system is a silo approach in the fight against fraud and corruption and crime in general. Today, we see greater levels of collaborations and coordination between the Investigative Directorate, the Asset Forfeiture Unit, the Special Commercial Crime Unit within the Special Investigating Unit, and the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation. This has been self-evident with the ACTT records recording 35 cases in court involving 180 accused. In total, the Investigative Directorate has enrolled 32 cases involving 187 accused individuals have appeared in court for alleged state capture-related offenses. This is not something to be scoffed at, as it is proof that accountability is beginning to take shape. It might have taken time, but gradually these institutions are beginning to yield results. This is the same work that has led to the recovery of 12.5 billion rands into the fiscus. Furthermore, the impact of the performance of law enforcement agencies can be felt in all areas of our democracy. When law enforcement agencies fail to perform, we are judged as a country by international financial institutions such as rating agencies, the Financial Action Task Force, and so on. Capacitation of these entities, including the NPA, has received the much needed injection of funds to assist in achieving their mandate. The impact of grey listing by FATF, which we are soon to receive the final outcomes, will have a dire effect on our economy and ability to raise funds in the international markets. This is where coordination and collaboration is needed to work together to strengthen the criminal justice cluster and with the economic cluster as well. And work is underway. We are awaiting the outcomes and we remain ready to attend to the issues raised and to address some of them, as we have already done in the amendment of some of the legislations that were identified. To ensure that the independence and security of tenure of the incumbents in the investigative directorate is strengthened, we are in a process of drafting a new bill, which is currently undergoing internal consultative processes between relevant departments and stakeholders. And hopefully it will also invigorate a debate on this matter. This work builds on President Ramaphosa's pronouncement in October as part of the actions we will undertake to implement the recommendations in the Judicial Commission's report. In the interim, while the consultative process are underway, we have assigned peace officers powers to the investigative directorate. This will enable them to arrest people, take statements, conduct search and seizure operations in line with the Criminal Procedure Act. Let me pause here to say that we are aware of the views that this structure has to be a Chapter 9 institution for us to meet the standards set out in the Glenister judgment. At the heart of this argument is the notion that in securing the independence of the NPA and its subsidiaries, its interface with government poses a danger to its autonomy and its independence. This is where we differ with the proponents of this view, because paragraph 58 of the Glenister 2 judgment is instructive, and it reads, "For our country to win the war against these serious crimes, we need to enhance the capacity of the police to prevent, combat, and investigate these crimes and other national priority crimes." Close quote. At paragraph 80, the same judgment supplements this view by invoking international law. It says an international law does not support the proposition advanced by the applicant either. For example, the legislative guide for the implementation of the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption provides, and I quote, "State parties may either establish an entirely new independent body or designate an existing body or department within an existing organization. In some cases, an anti-corruption body may be necessary to start combating corruption with fresh and concentrated energy. In other cases, it is often useful to enlarge the competency of an existing body to specifically include anti-corruption. Corruption is often combined with economic offenses or organized criminal activities. It is thus a sub-specialization of police, prosecution, judiciary, and other, for example, administrative bodies. Implementers are reminded that the creation of new bodies with hyper-specialization may be counterproductive if it leads to overlapping of competencies and need for additional coordination, etc., that will be hard to resolve." Close quote. Perhaps the most pointed rejection of this argument is found in paragraph 124 of the Glenister judgment, which reads, "The independence of any anti-corruption unit in the context of international agreements must not be confused with the independence of the judiciary. For example, nor does independence in the context of anti-corruption international agreements require that the executive should play no part in the functioning of anti-corruption agencies. Where this is to be the case, this will run afoul of the fundamental principles of our legal system as contained in our constitution, in particular section 206 1 and 179(6). Indeed, it is doubtful whether, if that had been the requirement, states like ours will have ratified these conventions. What is crucial, therefore, is whether the anti-corruption agency enjoys an adequate level of structural and operational autonomy, secured through institutional and other legal mechanisms aimed at preventing undue influence." Close quote. While it is true that Chapter 9 of our Constitution is where independent entities are housed in our democracy, we are of the view that the independence of an entity like the NPA and any subsidiaries cannot be looked through a simplistic lens of where the entity is housed. Its independence must be assessed via the lens of structural and operational autonomy. This was identified by the Glenister judgment and then again by the Judicial Commission on State Capture. Some of these reforms have begun to take shape. The clearest example is the manner in which the current National Director of Public Prosecution was appointed. We had a transparent selection process, and we will proceed to have engagement and continue to solicit views from society, including a forum of this nature, on the work that is ongoing in this regard. I would also like to speak on the issue of whistleblowers in our country. I would like to pay tribute to all the whistleblowers who have come forward to reveal the underbelly of unethical conduct and corruption in the public and the private sector. They are the true embodiment of a famous saying by British philosopher John Stuart Mill, when he said, "Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than the good men should look on and do nothing." Close quote. You are the good people who refuse to look on and do nothing. In many cases, this has come at great cost to their families and to themselves personally. The level of reprisal which whistleblowers are being subjected to is proving to be counterintuitive to the laudable goals of whistleblowing, which are in the main to mainstream integrity and exposure and expose unethical organizational cultures through detection and protection. Whistleblowing is an integral part of any anti-corruption framework. Quite clearly, in our context, there appears to be a gap in the overall intention of what the Public Disclosure Act seeks to do. One of the gaps we have identified is the fact that companies or government departments who are implicated by whistleblowers are not held accountable for victimizing whistleblowers. The second gap we have identified is how we can transition whistleblowers into the witnesses in the criminal cases where possible. In direct response to the recommendation by the Judicial Commission of Inquiry, comparative research is being done on the incentivization of whistleblowers, and we are hopeful that we will be able to release our discussion documents to close the gap and the loopholes and to reform the regime for whistleblowers in our country. The review of South Africa's anti-corruption architecture discussion document, which highlights the mandates of the various entities engaged in the fight against corruption, compares this with comparative international benchmarks, points to an outdated whistleblower protection regime. Consideration is also being given to the creation and modalities of the anti-corruption entity. This work will be the culmination of research and discussion that has been ongoing for the past 2 years. Distinguished guests, these are some of the reforms that we are currently seized with, and we will hopefully release these documents that I have alluded to for greater public inputs and participation to reshape these institutions that we believe should withstand any political or private or any other type of capture, but should only be guaranteed by the Constitution, legislation, and the rule of law in our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your participation, Minister. We appreciate your time, and we understand that you have urgent affairs of state to attend to in Pretoria, so we wish you well in your endeavors later in the day. It will be possible to catch up with what happens here on YouTube, because all of the proceedings, including your speech, are being recorded in cyberspace. Thank you very much.
Thank
Right,
you.
you can break that
I've been advised that the Director General of the department has joined physically there, so he may be able to engage with them.
That's very good news. Yes, he owns up. He's confessed to being present. He is here. He signed the register. We can prove it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Professor Kachalia, into whose time a little bite has been taken by the Minister. Professor.
Thank you, Paul. Let me say, all protocol observed. I haven't got a full list of the eminent people who are here, and So I prefer not to take the risk of an under-inclusion. But I am happy to be here, to engage with all of you. So many of you are playing important roles in furthering our fight against corruption. I thought I might be of assistance to this forum best by sharing with you some very preliminary reflections in the NACAC, which, as you all know, has been established to advise the president. We have not yet finalized our views on a very important question which this conference is engaged with, and on which we have some interesting views, I think, for consideration, about the institutional infrastructure of an anti-corruption agenda, and particularly on this question of a new anti-corruption agency. You have the Glenister judgment, the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, and the anti-corruption strategy adopted by Cabinet all envisage the establishment of a new agency. And the Minister has shared his reflections on the views of the Department of Justice on this matter. I want to share with you our very initial thoughts. Recently, when we had our first stakeholder engagement, we had the privilege of listening to Professor Stone, who identified 5 traps for any country considering the establishment of new institutions in the fight against corruption. And I want to share with you our understanding of what an all-government and an all-society approach, which is our mandate, might bring to this debate. Now, there are 2 traps which he mentioned. The first is to overemphasize in the fight against corruption issues of behavior as opposed to structure. This is what he said on this matter. When a government is afflicted by corruption, we tend to put the blame on people for 80% and structure for 20%. But we probably got the proportions reversed. What we in South Africa see in South Africa is that changing people and policies is not enough to rescue a government from entrenched corruption. More attention should be paid to making structural changes, and most important, to building a culture of professional excellence in government. So bear this in mind when I share with you our reflections on what we think the new agency should look like. And the second that he mentioned is to think that establishing a single agency is a panacea. And what he proposed is a multi-agency approach, because he made the point that a single agency might itself be vulnerable to capture. Now, it seems to us, and I say this on a very preliminary basis, that the debate in South Africa is dominated by a criminal justice, perpetrator-centered, legalistic conception of corruption, which points to the importance of focusing on resourcing the independence and so forth of the various institutions that make up the criminal justice system. And we can all agree that that is important, fundamental, and we've heard the minister share his reflections about what needs to be done to comply with Glenister, to strengthen the investigation and prosecution of what we can call criminal corruption. The role of NECAC, the council that I now chair, is to provide advice on the strengthening of the institutions of the criminal justice system and compliance with the requirements of the Constitution as set out in Glenister. And we haven't yet had an opportunity to do that. I want to distinguish this narrow conception, is important and essential, of corruption as being equivalent to criminal corruption, and a broader conception which we think should also inform how we think about the institutional infrastructure of a long-term anti-corruption agenda. I'm going to call that, for the time being, systemic corruption, as distinguished from a conception of corruption which focuses on behavior, on individual criminal acts. This perspective, that is the broader perspective, recognizes that corruption may be embedded in democratic institutions and in the administration of public services, and may include conduct that is not always illegal, but nevertheless inconsistent with the standards demanded in public life in a constitutional democracy. And therefore, the anti-corruption measures should include structural reform, the strengthening of existing institutions, and you've heard what the minister thinks about what should be done, but also establishing new institutions, including ones that can implement preventative measures, as well as to focus on behavioral change in an all-society approach. You can see how I think we've got a paradigm issue here. If you're focusing only on the institutions of the criminal justice system, then you're not focusing on an all-society, all-government approach. So these are our kind of very preliminary thoughts. Let's say I'm sharing them with you as the chairperson of NECAC at a very preliminary stage in our thinking. The Constitutional Court, the Zondo Commission, and the NECAC recommend establishing new anti-corruption institutions without clarifying the structure, powers, mandate, and location. But we all agree that the current institutional structure falls short. Our work stream on this topic is working on a proposed model for consideration by the presidency. We haven't finalized that model. So my remarks should be understood with those qualifications. My view is that the new anti-corruption institution that is established should be independent of the executive branch, focus on systemic corruption, prevention, and should have all the necessary powers and resources for this purpose. And when I presented these preliminary ideas at our stakeholder forum, there was some debate about the extent of its powers, about whether those powers should include typical law enforcement powers like entry and seizure. But it certainly should have auditing capabilities, forensic auditing capabilities, big data analytics, and so forth. Think about the problem we have in Tembisa Hospital. How does a paradigm which only deals with individual criminal acts retrospectively after the fact assist us? It assists us because we need accountability for criminal acts. But we also need, I think, as part of our institutional infrastructure, the ability to act proactively to deal with systemic corruption. agency that I'm suggesting here should have such powers would be able to go into an institution like the Tembisa Hospital, where there is evidence, say through whistleblowing or through a complaint system which should be put in place in such an institution, where there's sufficient evidence to initiate a forensic audit, and if there is evidence, for instance, as the Zondo Commission has done, to refer evidence of criminal conduct to the relevant agencies for investigation, prosecution, and so forth. We think possibly that the mandate of this new institution should include whistleblower protection, procurement fraud, public complaints, monitoring and evaluation, and public engagements, because we need to mobilize our society. We need to involve the whole of society in this fight against corruption. I'm almost done. The new body should probably not include. So there is ample opportunity for engagement with the Department of Justice. The new body should not include, this is our preliminary view, the agencies of law enforcement, like the NPA, the Hawks, the South African Police Service. In other words, those concerned with the investigation, prosecution, punishment of individual acts of criminality, like criminal corruption, fraud, bribery, and so forth. But it could refer matters for investigation and prosecution, as did the Zondo Commission, and collaborate with other anti-corruption agencies like the Public Protector, the FIC, SARS, the AG, the PSC, as well as those institutions that compose the Hawks, the NPA, SAPS, and so forth. And those institutions in the criminal justice cluster, the debate there should be about further resourcing, about capacitation, and about independence. The Department of Justice is proposing some possibilities, but it will be, you will now appreciate that the institution we are proposing, which does not incorporate these law enforcement agencies, is quite a different animal. And in our study of such bodies elsewhere, there are examples of bodies which include the law enforcement agencies and others which don't. And we should have that debate. It is inappropriate, possibly, to locate bodies with strong confidentiality requirements and those which are subject to ministerial direction, like the South African Police Service, in a new anti-corruption agency, which is constitutionally required to be independent of the government. So that's an important question. Whether when we talk about establishing new anti-corruption agency, we think that all these various components of the criminal justice system should be located in this body. The same body which has the responsibility to engage with society, receive public complaints, deal with systemic corruption proactively, and so forth. We also think that the proliferation of new agencies with overlapping mandates should be avoided. The Zondo Commission, for instance, recommends a new agency on public procurement. We're not sure if that proposal was fully thought through, but it may be better to think to avoid this problem of over-proliferation and overlapping mandates. And that the new proposed agency should be understood as being part of a national anti-corruption and integrity system, which in fact should include the Department of Education. Think about the role of the Department of Education needs to play in the fight against corruption. But if you focused only on the criminal justice system, then you lose sight of the role of the whole fabric of government institutions, as well as the possibilities of involving stakeholders, civil society, and the broader community in the fight. I would say finally that we think that the establishment of this agency is an absolute urgency and imperative. The Australians have just passed legislation to establish a new agency. I think it took them 10 years. We don't have 10 years. We think we should establish an agency which has such important powers to deal with systemic corruption yesterday. And so doing the necessary work, the research, doing the financial modeling, drafting of the legislation, and so forth, should be structured in such a way that we can get to an outcome as soon as possible. And that is going to depend on a consensus emerging. And I hope we can engage with people like Paul, the two Pauls, and others who have played such an important role in this discussion, to see that perhaps what we're offering is a way of engaging with the Department of Justice. This does not involve any involvement in matters which are within the domain of the Department of Justice. It doesn't involve us strategically in any of the complications concerned with the various ministries in the Department of Justice. So if we can reach this kind of consensus through stakeholder engagement on the kind of institution, agency, independent anti-corruption agency that we have in mind to deal with systemic corruption, then there are no impediments really to establishing this institution on an expedited basis. As I said, these are views that are under considerations in our council, but have not been finalized, and we look forward to the debate, because the debate is required to help us kind of finalize our model. After all, it is part of our mandate to engage with society, to engage with yourselves, in formulating our advice to the President. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. At this point, we are going to circulate in an anti-clockwise direction. I will ask the panel, the first panel, to come up this way, and everybody on the top shelf to go out that way. Nicola Taljart and Chris Andres from the sponsors, Nicola from Primerio and Chris from CAS, can come and sit next to me if they wish, or hide in the back if they don't, and the new panel can take its place. You go to the far. While we are politely waiting to seat. Yeah.
We'll start and get out quickly.
You're on. That's it. Just talk.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think we're in for a stimulating series of debates, particularly on the four topics that are to be dealt with by the panels. I think we should all express our gratitude to the Minister for the amount of time and trouble that has been taken, not only the fact he was here in a virtual way, but in relation to the work that's clearly been done in preparing his address. A number of interesting points that he raised. Some of them will, I'm sure, be greeted with enthusiasm and approval. There are other matters, however, which I think in the course of the day we will have things to add to what he has to say, and indeed possibly correct some of the comments made. But still, it was very interesting to hear what he had to say, and I enjoyed it very much. I must confess, as a moderator, I have to restrain myself. Moderators don't take part in the debates. They're like referees. You know, referees are not supposed to score goals. Not that I necessarily would score a goal even if I tried. But I will resist the temptation to deal with some of the points he made. I just want to say one thing, and that is the first topic, as you can see, is deals with what we're going to deal with next in this panel. What are the legal requirements for anti-corruption machinery of state achieving compliance with Glenister? And that is really the first question I would think that has to be considered in a debate such as the one that we're engaged in. And we all, particularly when we deal with compliance with Glenister, we have to deal with a point which the minister, as far as I could hear, didn't deal with, and which is at the center of the debate that we're going to have. And that is the finding by the Constitutional Court of the 5 standards that apply to adequate, should apply legally in South Africa for adequate anti-corruption machinery. The STIRS requisites, I take it all of you know about them. Those of you who would like to refresh your memories, you will find the book that we were given as a present reward for coming. Paul Hoffman's book, Countering the Corrupt, deals with the matter very fully, and of course it'll be dealt with very fully also in the speeches that are going to be made. But STIRS, the last S, STIRS, S-T-I-R-S, those are the 5 requisites. The last requisite, the second S, is the very important one, which up to now has been overlooked to a very large extent. When the National Public Prosecutor made a report to Parliament, she spoke about the new legislation. She spoke about the lessons that have been learnt. But one lesson that appears not to have been learnt was the lesson contained in the second S, which of course is security of tenure. And that's something that we will be looking at, I would imagine, very carefully, because if we don't comply with the last S, we may well find ourselves wasting our time. And, you know, a nation that forgets its history is obliged to relive it. We've gone through that already once. We had the Scorpions, which I think complied with the STIR. They didn't comply with the last S. And that was a very costly lesson that we had. There was talk earlier about having to have a debate that could be 10 years. We haven't got 10 years. The answer to that is, of course, we've had the 10 years, and look what happened to them. That lesson was, I won't say learnt, but it was there to be learnt. But that's a matter that our speakers will deal with. I don't have to give you the curricula vitae of our speakers, because they're on the document that you have. We will simply explain what's going to happen. Our first speaker is going to be Paul Pretorius, and he is going to deal with Glenister 2. The second decision of the Glenister series. He'll be followed by Isak Smuts, who will deal with Glenister 3, where I suspect Isak may indicate that we may have wandered a wee bit off the path of rectitude, but something that he will help guide us back onto. And then finally, we will have Lawson Naidu, and he will explain to us, give his views, approach to the way forward, what we must do, and how we're going to set about ensuring that the machinery that we devise and bring into operation is indeed adequate for the purpose and complies with our international obligations and our constitutional requirements. So, without further ado, I call upon Paul Pretorius to deliver his address.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Is this working? My job is to explain Glenister 2. It's a technical and complex judgment or set of judgments. And in the interests of clarity and given time constraints, I will concentrate on the issue of independence, but also perhaps venture briefly into other areas as well. I might just mention in response to the Minister's address, the Honourable Minister's address, that paragraphs 58, 80 and 124, which he quoted, come from the minority judgment. It's that same judgment which at paragraph 113 reads, "In the result, I conclude that there is no constitutional obligation to establish an independent anti-corruption unit. as contended by the applicant and the amicus. It follows, therefore, that the argument based on a constitutional obligation to establish an independent anti-corruption unit must fail. I will deal with the majority judgment in due course. In essence, at a structural level, what Glenister 2 was concerned with was the abolition or disbanding of the DSO or the Scorpions, and in its place, the creation of the DPCI or the Hawks. But importantly, the DSO Scorpions were taken out of the National Prosecuting Authority and placed into the South African Police Services. And this affected the accountability lines and the structure of the organization significantly. And it is that that was analyzed at some length in both judgments. So Glenister challenged the laws that brought about these two changes: the abolition, the establishment, the abolition of Scorpions, establishment of Hawks, and the movement of that body from NPA into the South African Police Services. Importantly, the duty dealt with was not only to establish the structure, but to maintain it. And that's an important qualification of the duty. And if I may remark, while independence is a principle, its true value lies obviously in effectiveness, which must surely be the primary goal, an elusive goal. Importantly, in terms of the Constitution, paras 19 and 64, the NPA must institute criminal proceedings, and the South African Police Services must prevent, combat, and investigate crime. So there's a bifurcation of the task of fighting corruption. And for me personally, given the experience of the Zondo Commission, it's fundamental. The minority judgment said, and I've already given the answer, one of the issues to be considered was, does the Constitution require Parliament to establish an independent anti-corruption unit? And if so, did Parliament comply? The minority judgment answered that question in the negative. The majority judgment answered it in the positive, at least the first part. Essential to the minority judgment, and this goes to the bifurcation issue, for our purposes at least, is a finding that it is untenable, I quote, untenable to suggest that without the power to investigate crimes that it prosecutes, the NPA cannot act without fear, favor, or prejudice. It's a fundamental finding. That finding institutionally has been tweaked with in the 11 years, 12 years since Glenister, but I'm dealing with the time at Glenister. It's important to understand that. The lesson of the Zondo Commission is clear. Investigation, the development of investigation strategies and prosecution are intertwined. And we now have hindsight advantage to show that. So the finding in paragraph 78 of the minority judgment that it is indeed doubtful whether the power to investigate crime can be said to be incidental to the power to prosecute crime must be called into question, and is called into question, has been since. And I'll deal with the lesson of Zondo, certainly as I have seen it in due course. Section 7.2 of the Constitution, the state has a positive duty under 7.2 to prevent and combat corruption and organized crime. That was a finding of the minority judgment. But fundamental finding of the majority judgment, there is no, the minority judgment, there is no constitutional obligation to establish an independent anti-corruption unit. Requirements of independence quoted in the minority judgment of the OECD, the power to initiate own investigations, that is fundamental. Those decisions as part of an anti-corruption strategy ought to reside in an independent body, a body independent of the executive, and certainly as far as the Hawks are concerned, do not. Allow investigators and prosecutors autonomous decision-making powers in handling cases, not to be subject to undue influence from any branch of government or third party, have structural and operational autonomy, and obviously transparent procedures for appointment and removal of directors and accountability. It's instructive that the NDPP, the National Director of Public Prosecution, should enjoy 10 years security of tenure. Not one to date has managed to reach the 10 years. The majority judgment was qualified. It said not full independence was required, but an adequate level of structural and operational autonomy. Of course, those are categories that must only be defined and clarified in practice. The true inquiry should be, I venture to suggest, what should the structure comprise of in order to be effective? The provisions of the South African Police Service Act were then analyzed in some detail, and it was concluded that within that act there were sufficient safeguards to protect a sufficient degree of independence on the part of the Hawks as they existed then. That's the DPCI. Fundamental, and I'll come to this at the moment, was the role of the Ministerial Committee. The Ministerial Committee is fundamental in the structure of the SAPS Act. And what it says is that it is the Ministerial Committee that must in effect strategize, create policy, and it has the power to establish priority crimes. That's where the think tank is, the think tank that deals with what the Zondo Commission tried to achieve. The majority judgment, and if I must be frank, which we must be because we're dealing with such an important issue. We must be frank anyway, but we now know that that Ministerial Committee failed dismally in its strategy task over certainly the state capture years. And the question is it doing its duty now? Because that duty remains. The majority judgment agreed with the minority on a number of issues. The legislation establishing the DPCI was not irrational. Public involvement was sufficiently involved in the creation of the legal framework. The Constitution doesn't oblige the Specialized Corruption Fighting Unit to be contained within the NPA, but there must be one. The creation of the DPCI, the Hawks in the South African Police Service, was not in itself unconstitutional. And the abolition of the DSO and the creation of the DPCI was not unconstitutional. Two questions remain for the majority. Is there an obligation on the state to establish and maintain an independent body to combat corruption and organized crime? I stress establish and maintain. Yes, was the answer. If so, does the law creating the DPCI, the Hawks, meet the requirement of independence? The answer was a clear no. The legislation was therefore declared unconstitutionally invalid, and the order was suspended for a period of 18 months. The finding, there is, however, no doubt that the scheme of the Constitution and legislation as a whole imposes a pressing duty on the state to set up a concrete and effective mechanism to prevent and root out corruption and cognate corruption practices. The quote, dealing with independence, highlights 5 issues: free from undue political interference, genuine political will, that is a requirement of effectiveness, and that's important. A comprehensive anti-corruption strategy, that is also important. And the question to be asked, in all the legislation, the Constitution, and with the proliferation of crime-fighting structures that we have at the moment, where is that think tank? And that is crucial, and I'll illustrate why if I have a moment. Structural and operational autonomy, clear legal basis, and mandate. That duty is intrinsic to the Constitution, and it's constitutionally enforceable. So the minority is wrong. Our Constitution does require the state to create an independent anti-corruption entity, and our law demands a body outside executive control to deal effectively with corruption. The DPCI therefore lacked the necessary independence as required by domestic law, informed by international law and the Constitution. I want to deal with the Ministerial Committee because I must focus. The quote is, "Our gravest disquiet." That was the judgment's precise words. For a Ministerial Committee to determine policy guidelines for the functioning of the Hawks, the DPCI, which was what existed at the time on its own, and for the selection of national priority offences was a fundamental transgression of the requirement of independence. The judgment found that the DPCI was subordinated to executive control. Importantly, and we know this from hindsight, ministers oversee an anti-corruption entity where of necessity they are themselves part of the operational field within which it is supposed to function. To quote again, hands-on management, hands-on supervision, and hands-on interference. And that the majority found impossible to square with the requirement of independence. And with hindsight, we know that over the last 10 years, if not now too, the Ministerial Committee and Parliament clearly failed in their duties as set out in the SAPS, South African Police Services Act. So for these reasons, concluded the majority, the statutory structure creating the DPCI offends the constitutional obligation resting on Parliament to create an independent anti-corruption entity, which is both intrinsic to the Constitution itself and which Parliament assumed when it approved. 5 minutes, okay. All right, I'm watching a clock in front of me ticking down. Now, you will know when you have 10 seconds to challenge a decision. I have no idea. I just want to digress for a moment. What the fundamental question asked by the Zondo Commission is, are we dealing with isolated and ad hoc acts of corruption, or is there something more? And what the Zondo Commission was able to do quite successfully, despite all its criticisms, despite all the faults, what it was able to do was establish patterns, relationships. It was able to look where crime was being protected, not prosecuted, and that really was its great contribution. It conducted money flows. It investigated thoroughly at a very broad and high level in order to find out what was going on the ground, and therein lied its effectiveness, to develop a detailed investigative strategy and prosecuting strategy. What is required in anti-corruption, therefore, the Zondo Commission illustrated, is a high-level, highly skilled investigative think tank, something like the Ministerial Committee, which obviously is not an ideal locus for such an obligation. I just want to read a list of issues that face us today. And I'll do so without comment. Sabotage at Eskom, sabotage at Transnet, theft or robbery in the coal supply chain, bus transport mafia, construction criminality mafia, University of Fort Hare assassination, innumerable political assassinations, particularly at a municipal level, Tembisa hospital assassination, mining mafia, including the Zama-Zamas, stripping of infrastructure, July unrest, where are the ringleaders? Continuing procurement corruption, combined by a narrative of attacks on the Constitution and judiciary by senior politicians. The question must again be asked, are these random ad hoc acts of criminality, or are there organizational links between them? Are they or some of them part of an organized project? Is there a recognizable aim or motive, that is access to the vast financial resources of the state? Why is it so that there have been relatively few arrests and prosecutions? Deocoran assassination, July unrest, Fort Hare assassination, Eskom sabotage. And I'm talking about the people high up, not those people necessarily on the ground. These orders come from somewhere. Where is the money flowing? Are there connections and protection within the political establishment? The role of public service politicians, elective representatives in facilitating and profiting from this, is there being investigated? Are these questions being asked? By whom and where? That is a fundamental issue to deal with in fighting corruption and in implementing Glenister 2. Thank you.
Thank you for being 1 minute shorter than you needed to be. Your laundry list of questions was answered by Kgalema Motlanthe in 2007, and what he said is on the last page of the program, just above the hand with the STIRS criteria. I think Smuts is next, and
Yes,
he's
sir.
got 18 minutes, but you're in charge.
Yes, all right.
Oh, I needed one piece of, if anybody's got questions, write them down on a piece of paper like we did at FW last Thursday, and move them to that end of the room, and we will then arrange and put questions at the end of this panel.
I
Thanks.
understand the questions which you hand in will be gone through by Paul and his assistants. They will prepare a short list of the most important questions, which I will then put on your behalf to the speakers. There's a famous lawyer in America who was very short in the argument. On one occasion, the Chief Justice was very strict in the Supreme Court of the United States. But he ended triumphantly and said, I have 5 minutes left and I donate them to the court. Well, the minute that was left, there was no donation, but it was grabbed by Paul, and so we benefited from what he had to say. We now move on to a more controversial decision, I think, than Glenister 2, one which has been criticized, and it is not bulletproof, and I'm sure we will hear things from Isak Smuts which reflect at least on the unsoundness of part of the judgment. But I call on Isak Smuts to tell us about Glenister 3.
Thank you. Is that the school board?
Your 18 minutes begins now.
Thank you. I shan't require them. Yeah, I bear the battle scars of Glenister 3, but one may legitimately inquire, having heard from Paul how the requirements of an appropriate anti-corruption establishment were defined in the majority judgment in Glenister 2, why we need a conference of this nature at all. The judgment of the majority in Glenister 2 is a work of art. We who earn our livings in the courts seldom have sufficient time to read judgments to assess the poetry, the linguistic symmetry, or the analysis of a judgment in sufficient detail. This judgment is worth reading for just those purposes. It examines the objectives of a constitution designed to promote and protect a developing democracy. It examines and underlines the relevant constitutional principles of application to the inquiry. And it underlines the relevant requirements, placing our democracy amongst the family of nations that have committed themselves to the global fight against corruption, highlighting also our international obligations in the field. It's quite frankly a thing of beauty. But moving on to its message, the solution, one might think, is plain. Line up these requirements, put the structure into operation, and nail the blighters. If only it were that easy. In the light of the findings in Glenister 2, amending legislation was adopted, purportedly to meet the requirements of the majority judgment in that matter. Neither Bob Glenister nor the Helen Suzman Foundation were satisfied that the amendments met the requirements of the majority, and the issues returned to court. A major contributor to the fact that we are still having this debate, nearly 12 years after the majority judgment in Glenister 2 was delivered, was the confusion which was occasioned by the majority judgment in the follow-up proceedings, in which Paul Hoffman's Dale Carnegie-trained team of activists called politely Glenister 3, and in what I couldn't help but think of as Mogoeng's revenge. The former Chief Justice was a member of the minority in Glenister 2, but penned the majority judgment in Glenister 3. The confusion was exacerbated by the fact that the two co-authors of the majority judgment in Glenister 2, Moseneke DCJ and Cameron J, could not agree in Glenister 3 on what they had jointly determined in Glenister 2. And for us lesser abled minds, the challenge was quite considerable. I propose to examine what emerged in Glenister 3 with particular reference to the case advanced by Bob Glenister himself, as opposed to that presented on behalf of the Helen Suzman Foundation, which focused on specific aspects of the amending legislation. And then to see what remains of the findings in Glenister 2, which Paul has summarized. Glenister's case in the Constitutional Court differed in approach from that of the Helen Suzman Foundation, which focused on specific provisions in the legislation. Focusing quite specifically on arguments that the required degree of independence for the Hawks had not been attained in the amending legislation. And while Glenister himself contested the constitutionality of various provisions in the amending legislation, he went further in focusing on the entire scheme of the amending legislation, arguing that it was fatally flawed. Critically, he contended it failed on the crucial issue of independence. Unsurprisingly, he looked to the language employed in the majority judgment in Glenister 2 to determine whether the amending legislation met the specified standards, the STIRS requirements, and particularly that of independence. And there were three elements of the judgment that stood out in such an examination. The first was this, and I quote, "The creation of a separate corruption fighting unit within the South African Police Service, SAPS, was not, and I stress, in itself unconstitutional. And thus the DPCI legislation cannot be invalidated on that ground alone." And Glenister contended that the phrases "in itself" and "on that ground alone" should be read to have meaning. And we presented that argument with some conviction. The second element was this. "Now plainly," and I quote again, "now plainly there are many ways in which the state can fulfill its duty to take positive measures to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights. This court will not be prescriptive as to what measures the state takes, as long as they fall within the range of possible conduct that a reasonable decision maker in the circumstances may adopt. A range of possible measures is therefore open to the state, all of which will accord with the duty the Constitution imposes, and I stress again, so long as the measures taken are reasonable." Again, Glenister contended that the words "in the circumstances" and "so long as the measures taken are reasonable" were meaningful and should be so interpreted. And we who presented that case were all persuaded that O'Regan J. had illustrated the position definitively in her judgment in the matter of Rail Commuters Action Group and Others versus Transnet Limited, trading as Metro Rail, where she set out in another thing of beauty the considerations as follows. "What constitutes reasonable measures will depend on the circumstances of each case. Factors that would ordinarily be relevant would include the nature of the duty, the social and economic context in which it arises, the range of factors that are relevant to the performance of the duty, the extent to which the duty is closely related to the core activities of the duty bearer. The closer they are, the greater the obligation on the duty bearer, and the extent of any threat to fundamental rights should the duty not be met, as well as the intensity of any harm that may result. The more grave is the threat to fundamental rights, the greater is the responsibility on the duty bearer. Thus, an obligation to take measures to discourage pickpocketing may not be as intense as an obligation to take measures to provide protection against serious threats to life and limb. The third consideration in Glenister 2 was this, and I quote again, "This court has indicated that the appearance or perception of independence plays an important role in evaluating whether independence in fact exists. This was said in connection with the appointment procedures and security of tenure of magistrates. By applying this criterion, we do not mean to impose on Parliament the obligation to create an agency with a measure of independence appropriate to the judiciary," the phrase that Paul quoted. "We say merely that public confidence in mechanisms that are designed to secure independence is indispensable. Whether a reasonably informed and reasonable member of the public will have confidence in an entity's autonomy protecting features is important to determining whether it has the requisite degree of independence. Hence, if Parliament fails to create an institution that appears from the reasonable standpoint of the public to be independent, it has failed to meet one of the objective benchmarks for its independence. This is because public confidence that an institution is independent is a component of, or is constitutive of, its independence." And on that point too, Bob Glenister contended that public confidence in the independence was not established and was lacking in the Amendment Act. On that basis, he then approached the application in the matter that became HSF against the President and Glenister 3. He set out to illustrate that the scheme did not fall within the range of possible conduct that a reasonable decision maker could adopt in the circumstances, and that accordingly Parliament had not adopted reasonable measures required by Glenister 2 to respect, protect, promote and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights. And he referred to a host of incidents and events that evidenced corruption, and by reference to expert testimony premised upon evidence of corruption and public perception thereof, he advanced his attack on the Amendment Act. The interesting point is that the respondents who opposed the application had chosen not to respond to the evidence, and a substantial body of it there was, that Glenister advanced. It simply requested the High Court to strike it out, and the High Court duly obliged. That formed part of Glenister's appeal to the Constitutional Court. Early in the Concourt hearings, there were indications in questioning from the bench that at least an element of the bench saw the judgment in Glenister 2 quite differently from the way in which Glenister himself had interpreted it. And the difference in interpretation of what the express terms of the judgment meant was starkly illustrated in a comparison of the judgment of the majority in Glenister 3, penned by Mogoeng CJ, and a minority judgment written by Furneman J, with which Cameron J agreed, and with a substantial element of which there was further agreement from other members of the bench, but nevertheless a minority. The majority judgment said the following. I confess that I do not see this as a thing of beauty. "The allegations in the struck-out material amount to reckless and odious political posturing, or generalizations which should find no accommodation or space in a proper court process. The objective appears to be to scandalize and use the court to spread political propaganda that projects others as irredeemable crooks who will inevitably actualize Mr. Clem Santer's alleged projection that South Africa may well become a failed state." The majority struck out that evidence, including the expert evidence. With that, it struck out his attack on the fact that the hawks had been located within the police service. What was struck out included evidence from highly regarded academic sources, an affidavit and report from Professor Gavin Woods of the Anti-Corruption Education and Research Centre at Stellenbosch University, and an affidavit of Mr. Gareth Newman, the head of the Crime and Justice Program at the Institute for Security Studies, describing it as odious political posturing. Much of that evidence read now appears to be a first draft of what eventually appeared as the Zondo Commission report. As an aside, one wonders whether the current Chief Justice, who was a member of the majority, still holds the view that it was odious political posturing. Froneman J. in the minority judgment said this: the main judgment finds that Glenister 2 foreclosed both the constitutional challenge that Mr. Glenister sought to bring against the SAPS Amendment Act, as well as the evidence that he sought to adduce to sustain that challenge. I disagree. Glenister 2 does neither. If that decision needs to be revisited, it must be done appropriately with reasoned discussion and justification for any change. It should not be done by reinterpretation of its meaning that narrows its original scope without explaining the necessity for change. With reference to the manner in which Glenister 2 dealt with the constitutional obligation to establish an anti-corruption authority, Froneman J. recorded the following, quote, the judgment does not state that the creation of a separate corruption fighting unit within the SAPS will withstand any constitutional attack. It says that something else will be needed in order to sustain that kind of constitutional change. Mr. Glenister sought to show that the additional factor was that the current extent of corruption in our body politic was of the kind that showed that the location of the DPCI within SAPS was not a possible option for a reasonable decision maker. In other words, he contended that this evidence showed that locating the DPCI within SAPS meant that it could not have, quote, sufficient attributes of independence to fulfill the function of it required under the Constitution. The uninitiated reader may be excused for wondering how two interpretations of the same judgment could be so diametrically opposed, particularly when it is considered that the majority judgment in Glenister 2 was penned by Moseneke DCJ and Cameron J, with whom Froneman J, amongst others, concurred, while Moseneke DCJ concurred with the majority judgment in Glenister 3, and Cameron J concurred with Froneman J's majority judgment. One is reminded of the celebrated phrase from Alice in Wonderland, when I use a word, it means exactly what I intended to mean, nothing more and nothing less. So what did survive after the majority in Glenister 3? It's not unfair to suggest that the essential requirements spelt out in Glenister 2 did survive, although somewhat hollowed out. The majority in Glenister 3 certainly lowered the bar for an acceptable level of independence. For example, even where the Western Cape High Court had declared Section 17CA of the Amendment Act unconstitutional, this determined the process for the appointment of the national head of the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, consolidating the power to appoint the head in the minister and the cabinet, which one might not think free of executive interference. The majority judgment found the section to be constitutionally compliant. It was no surprise when shortly after this judgment was delivered, the head of the DPCI, Anwar Dramat, was suspended from office and resigned rather than going through the process envisaged from him. But certain other limitations were struck down. Regulations providing for ministerial interference were struck out. And interestingly, where the majority judgment in Glenister 2 had said the Constitutional Court did not want to be prescriptive, the majority in Glenister 3 in fact legislated and excised and severed elements of the amending legislation. So the essential requirements of an independent anti-corruption institution accordingly remain as part of our law. And what is critical is the element referred to by Paul Pretorius, which is a genuine political will to make it work. The other requirements of security of tenure, adequate training, specialization, and the provision of resources are still there on paper. The challenge facing South Africa is the fact that these requirements have not nearly been met since spelled out in Glenister 2 nearly 12 years previously. And Glenister 3 sounds a warning that we shall have to be on guard to ensure that the requirements are given real content rather than remaining fine-sounding concepts. And if we can persuade the minister's advisors to read beyond the minority judgment in Glenister 2 and go as far as the majority judgment, that may be of some assistance in the package that the department is seeking to address. But I pose the question, how many more Zondo commissions will be required before we take these requirements seriously? And to use cricketing parlance, it's your innings.
Thank you, Isaac. A very thoughtful and insightful presentation. Now it's my duty to call upon Lawson Naidoo to address us on the path ahead.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt you, Lawson. I need to speak to my friends in cyberspace because the chat room in cyberspace is open, and anybody in cyberspace who wants to participate in questions and answers is free to do so by putting their questions into the chat room. And I don't see too many pieces of paper flying around in this room, but that's perhaps because the presentations are so overwhelming.
I've got 2 pieces of paper so far, but I'm
sign.
prepared to accept more. But before we get to deal with the pieces of paper, Lawson Naidoo first must take us down the path ahead.
Thank you, and thank you to Paul and Isaac for dealing with the legal issues emanating from those 2 Glenister judgments. What I'm going to try and sketch out for you is what's happened in practice from 2011 until where we find ourselves today. And I want to start by making reference to a research report that CASAC published in March of 2011. In fact, it was launched literally a week before the judgment in Glenister 2 was delivered. And that was a piece of work aimed at looking at the constitutional and legal legislative landscape in South Africa and what were the gaps that existed in terms of creating an effective anti-corruption machinery. The title of that paper was Combating Corruption Towards a Comprehensive Societal Response. Resonates very strongly with the issue which I'll come to in a moment and which Feroz has touched on already, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which was adopted in 2020, which speaks similarly of a whole of society response to combating corruption. Shortly after that, you will recall that we had the National Development Plan. It sometimes gets mentioned by politicians in speeches. But that National Development Plan, in its final iteration, supported the multi-agency approach towards combating corruption. Interestingly, the draft of the NDP had supported the single agency model, which is what was espoused in that CASAC document of March 2011. So we then had the Hawks, and you've heard the critique of the judgments and implicitly of the ineffectiveness of the Hawks over the past decade or so. And I think what then happened was at some point, and I think it was around 2013, 2014, the so-called Anti-Corruption Task Force, the ACTT, came into being. And that was a recognition that there needed to be greater coordination amongst these different law enforcement agencies in order to effectively combat corruption. Now, that's been an informal structure and remains so to this day, even though it is still in existence and arguably a lot more effective today than it was at its inception 8 or 9 years ago. And that's largely to do with the issue which Paul has highlighted, and I think is the most critical issue when dealing with the aspects of combating corruption is there the political will to do so? Because various studies have shown that you can design whatever system you like. If there is no political will, it will not succeed. It's as simple as that. And together, going hand in hand with political will is all of the STIRS criteria and specifically the issues of resourcing. What we then have a series of recommendations that have come out of the Zondo Commission reports, and there are 3 structural recommendations that the Chief Justice makes in his reports. We've referred to some of them already. One is that the Commission of Inquiry should become a standing Commission of Inquiry, a permanent inquiry into state capture that is established, and I think quite controversially proposes that standing commission should be able to exercise oversight over Parliament. Now, Parliament is a democratically elected body, and I'm not quite sure whether on the issue of the separation of powers, but certainly on the issue of the autonomy of Parliament to have a non-elected body exercising oversight over Parliament. Now, we know there are myriad failings of Parliament that are highlighted in the Zondo reports, but I don't think that that's necessarily an appropriate way to deal with Parliament's failings in that regard. The Zondo Commission has also recommended that an agency be established for the protection of whistleblowers. And then thirdly, that there should be another agency that deals with procurement issues and combating corruption in the procurement space. So 3 different agencies that are proposed in the Zondo reports. And then we have the NACAC. And as Professor Kachalia has pointed out, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy was endorsed by Cabinet in November of 2020. The National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council was established in the middle of last year as one of the recommendations that emanates from that anti-corruption strategy. And I don't want to repeat what Pharaoh said earlier, but I will come back to some of what he said, because I think it needs to be emphasized in the context of this discussion. And I think it raises critical issues that we need to engage in, taking into consideration the sort of legal background of where the 2 Glenister cases in particular leave us. And then we've got the proposal which the Minister of Justice referred to, and the proposal for the establishment of a Chapter 9 institution or an integrity commission to deal with corruption. And I think with references made to the STIRS criteria from the Glenister 2 judgment, which I think we would all support and buy into. But if I might, I might want to add an extra vowel to the STIRS category, because I think there's an A missing in there, and that is the issue of accountability. There's a lot of emphasis on the independence of any anti-corruption agency, but it must equally be effectively accountable. And I think that's something that we need to place some emphasis on. And I think in some of the discussions that CASAC has espoused is that the issue of accountability needs to be placed high on that agenda, and the role of Parliament as the accounting body needs to be clearly defined. I think over and above, and there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of focus around one aspect of combating corruption, which is the investigation and prosecution element of it. But it's a much broader issue, as Feroz raised earlier, that he spoke about the narrow conception of corruption and the broader one. And I think there are 2 other elements of an anti-corruption strategy that cannot and must not be neglected. and that is steps taken to prevent corruption, whether at a systemic level, at a organizational level, at an ethical level, at a departmental level. And then critically, the issue of public awareness around corruption and what can be done to combat it. This is something that has largely been left to the civil society sector to deal with, because very little attention is given to it by the state. And it's certainly an investigating and prosecutorial body such as the DSO or the Hawks or even the NPA is not best suited to carrying out that mandate. So I think it brings me really to the issue of where do we go to from here. We've also heard that the president is on record as saying that he wants to, having established the investigating directorate in the NPA, now wants to create that as a permanent structure. So we've got all these proposals floating around at the moment, and I think it's going to be the task of the NACAC to come up with a set of proposals that create some clarity about where we need to go and how to combine what Feroz spoke about earlier as the narrow and the broader conceptions of corruption. So on the issue of the investigating and prosecutorial side, I think we're seeing again, and this is without wanting to sound like I'm yearning for a return of the scorpions, but a prosecutorial-led investigative process, I think, has proven to be very, very successful, not just in South Africa, but globally. So I think that's something that a reconfiguration of the law enforcement agencies, that's an approach that will need to be adopted. And whether there's how that actually plays out will have to be defined, but it's certainly something I think that needs to be done. And again, Feroz has made reference to a whole range of other agencies in that anti-corruption space. The SAPS, the Hawks, the SIU, the AFU. The list goes on, including the Chapter 9 institutions of the Public Protector and the Auditor General. And there needs to be some rationalization and ensuring that there is no overlap of mandates within that space. But I'm certainly being won over to the argument that Feroz is putting forward, that the agency that the NACAC might want to establish is really going to deal with the latter two issues of looking at systemic corruption and preventative measures in that regard, as well as public awareness. But I think the one issue that remains for us to perhaps ponder and think about is what is the relationship between that agency and the investigation and prosecutorial body? What are the links there? Because if the agency, as Feroz has articulated, is going to receive complaints from the public, what does it then do with them? Does it conduct a sort of initial scan or a high-level review of the complaint and then refer it to the law enforcement agencies to prosecute? And if so, what then is the reporting mechanism back to the agency that has referred the complaint? So I think those are some of the issues that we still need to address. And I know these are issues that are on the agenda of the NACAC, but I think a gathering such as this is really important in helping to crystallize some of those issues and to provide possible solutions to them. I think, again, the other issues that we need to focus on in this discussion is about the location of that agency. It's got to be independent, outside of executive control or authority, but where precisely does it sit? I have some sympathy for the minister's view that a Chapter 9 entity may not be appropriate. And before Paul jumps on my back, I'm going to say that we've seen also how Chapter 9 agencies can be captured. So that's not a panacea for what we're looking at. And I think we need to really focus on on the detail of the institution and its reporting mechanism to ensure that it is effectively independent, as I've said. So perhaps let me give you 5 minutes back, Paul, and end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawson, for the 5 minutes back, and let's go straight on to the Q&A.
Yes, I have been handed three questions for the moment, which I shall put to the panel. The first one is addressed to Advocates Pretorius and Smuts. Is it legally possible to apply directly for the court to seek proper implementation of the STIRS criteria? Is it legally possible to apply directly to the court to seek proper implementation of the STIRS criteria? Paul, would you like to start by
All right.
answering? Anything to be added?
Just for information, the STIRS criteria to stop corruption are specialized, trained, independent, resourced, and secure. The Constitutional Court will not dictate an interpretation unless it forms part of a legitimate suit before it. It will judge any decision Parliament makes in applying any criteria that it deems applicable against the requirements of the Constitution and its prior judgments. Now, that's a generalized answer, but it's important to understand, especially for non-lawyers, the position of the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court will not dictate the form and structure, nor the activities or even policies of any structures that these are created, but it will, after the event, judge whether what has been done by Parliament meets the requirements of the Constitution and law. So Glenister 2 says, more specifically, we emphasize that the form and structure of the entity in question lie within the reasonable power of the state, provided only that whatever form and structure are chosen do indeed endow the entity in its operation with sufficient independence. So the Constitutional Court will look at what is done by Parliament and it will pass judgment on that. It won't, before the event, give clarity on qualifications set out, for example, in the STIRS criteria.
Isaac, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, I mean, it would be offensive to our separation of powers doctrine if we had the Constitutional Court legislating. That's not its role. It's entitled to test legislation. The interesting thing about Glenister 3 was when the Constitutional Court did intervene regarding the Amendment Act, it granted or it ordered that certain elements of the Amendment Act should be struck out or severed without any of the parties having asked for that.
Thank you. The next question is for Lawson. Is the final responsibility of the Minister of Justice over the NPA consonant with the independence of the NPA?
Thanks to whoever asked that question. Yeah, it's a critical one, and I think that needs to be seriously reviewed. There is no agreement on what that means in terms of what the final responsibility of the minister is. We'll know and we'll recall that it was used as a pretext for a previous Minister of Justice to seek to interfere with the National Director of Public Prosecutions, which led to his suspension and ultimate removal from office. So I think it is inconsistent with the notion of the National Prosecuting Authority exercising its functions without fear, favor, or prejudice. And I think it was certainly a recommendation from the Ginwala report into the suspension of Vusi Pikoli that aspect of the Constitution be reviewed.
Thank you. All right, I've been handed two questions which more or less cover the same ground. I'll read them both. Given that the NPA has serious functionality problems and will have them for many years, is an independent and new corruption investigation and prosecuting body not a necessity for combating corruption? Perhaps you could, I don't know which of the three panelists wishes to deal with that, but
I'd like to say something about that.
I can see that from the twinkle in your eye.
Look, I mean, I think we know, and certainly we know from the reports of the Zondo Commission, if we didn't know previously, the impact of state capture on hollowing out state institutions, and the NPA was not only not immune from that, was probably one of the prime targets of that state capture process. But I think we must also give the NPA the credit that it does deserve. I mean, there have been serious attempts to try and turn it around. The minister made reference in his speech earlier about the resuscitation of the aspirant prosecutors program, the recruitment drive that's taking place within the NPA, the minister's own role in terms of making sure that additional resources are being mobilized for the NPA. And yes, it's going to take a long time to fix and get the NPA back to the kind of body that we require in South Africa. There is a huge capacity shortage there still, and they're looking at creative mechanisms of bringing in external capacity to meet those demands. But I think that the question really is, you know, if we set up another agency, where are we going to get the skills from? Because if they're not available for the NPA, they're not going to be available anywhere else. So you know, I don't see that as a viable option, and I would rather say let's focus on fixing the NPA. It's a critical institution in our democracy, within the not just in terms of fighting corruption, but in terms of fighting crime generally. So I would certainly suggest that we lend our support to making sure that the NPA becomes the organization that the Constitution envisages.
Thank you very much. I'm informed by our sponsors, the accountability now in the form of Paul Hoffman, that we run out of time. I had some very interesting questions before me, which would have led to a very interesting debate, or rather further interesting debate following on the one we've had before. But that's something that those who asked the questions may wish to put to the panelists privately during the break, which we're now taking. How long is the break?
May I just comment on something that Lawson has just said there?
Yes.
I don't agree with the proposition that if skills and resources are not available to the NPA, they're not going to be available to anyone else. I referred, and with reference to the Glenister 2 judgment, to the family of nations in which we operate, and there are enormous international skills available, which I would contend are not only available in the countries within which they operate, but which would readily be made available to a South African authority, both, I would suggest, to the prosecuting authority and to the independent anti-corruption unit or agency that we're looking at. And so we should seek that assistance and tap into those skills and experience on both levels wherever we can.
There's a further point to be made. Thank you for that, Isak. And that is, in the old days, when the Attorney General of the day thought his staff wasn't able or capable of dealing with a particular specialized point, members of the bar were briefed. When we think of the Milne early prosecution, or prosecutions involving Wolf Heather, and there are other examples as well. So there's no reason why the members of the bar in South Africa, I'm not saying we mustn't accept international assistance and cooperation, but we mustn't downvalue our own bar, which contains a number of very, very capable and competent and able and learned counsel who could be of great assistance on brief in dealing with the matters of the kind discussed. One such advocate is one who has covered himself with distinction in the Zondo Commission, and I And I may be embarrassing him, and if so, I apologize, but I won't keep him anonymous. It's Paul Pretorius. But he illustrates the very point that the people who appeared before the Zondo Commission were members of the bar, and they did an outstanding job. And I think our country owes a great debt of gratitude to them. Paul, you said you wanted to say something. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you with those comments, but they were sincerely meant.
Thank you, much appreciated. Very rare, I must tell you. I just wanted to make one point. International crime, local crime, and they are linked. Financial crime are obviously very highly sophisticated operations. And I suspect that we may be still in the era of the deerstalker, magnifying glass, and dusting for fingerprints age. The Zondo Commission had a room of highly sophisticated equipment, which our law enforcement agencies sadly do not have. Basically, the point I'm making is that technological sophistication is vital to any successful investigative effort.
Right, thank you very much. That is probably a very helpful and interesting note upon which to end. I want to thank the three panelists for all the hard work they did before they came here and for the enlightening and helpful contributions they made to the debate, and also thank those who sent in questions. As I say, some have been used. Those that haven't been used, the questioners can address the questions to the panelists during the break. How long is the break going to be, Paul Hoffman?
What we are going to do now is take a photograph of everybody in the room, simply come up this end. We'll all stand for the photograph and get close together. It should be fun. And then we will break for tea, which is in the staff common room, one floor down on the north side of the building. It's better than standing in the sun on the stairs outside, where you could get baked by the wind and the weather. So will everybody please just come forward, and we will crowd around the front of the room. I'm putting the photographer in charge now. I'm taking a break.
Is it compulsory, Paul?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I was late. I was caught in a mother and father traffic.
If they can watch it, you're welcome. What do you recommend?
Just put your just put your point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's easy.
Are you here
Big smile from the channel. Yes. From the phone, you need this.
What did I bring? That's been the problem from the word. Dealt with. I didn't understand why the Chief Justice should not be followed by the majority. Permeated right to tranche others on because they are I like that. I can inquire. I'll tell you what they said. Do as little as possible to try and comply. Okay. Enjoy the skeleton cast. Are you guys ready? Okay. Oh, well, that's my fault, yeah. Okay. We won't eat like students. Okay.
All right, I think we have a sufficient consensus that we should get on with the conference. We're mindful of the fact that the people with us in cyberspace have not been treated to the catering that has been laid on at tea time, and I think we've used up more time than we wanted to. Our next panel is assembled behind me and is called Panel 2 on the program in front of you. So I will stop talking. I do have to confess that I encourage people to bring tea and coffee and food up with them. Just be careful with it because they've just recycled this room and we don't want all of the leftovers trampled into the carpet or whatever. The caterers have been asked to come and collect. So if you pass the used crockery down towards the door side of the room, we'll solve the problem. Those who came late are not in. Oh, yes. The gentlemen, the heads are as close to Nursery Gorge as you can get. And ladies, the fire escape that we use to get to the common room is where your convenience lies. All right, Ben, over to you. And here is a time machine. You can allocate minutes to your speakers as you see fit. We were giving 18 last time. Perhaps we can give 20 this time because we got a free run to lunch now. And same drill, questions in cyberspace in the chat room and questions in the room on paper to be sorted and arranged and passed on to Ben. Over to you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. Many of the discussions we find on a day-to-day basis, and today will go about law, it'll go about theory and what need to happen. But nowhere does it come home. Nowhere does it come home as it does when it comes to whistleblowers, because people's lives are lost. Their livelihoods are lost. And let me just quote a few of them. Babita Dio Quran. 800 million rand was siphoned and she lost her life in the process. She was murdered. We should not put fancy words around that. Matopelo More exposed 200 million rands worth of corruption in the Daybreak farms. Patricia Mashale is a SAPS whistleblower, and she is out in the cold at the moment, suffering severely. The Whistleblower House opened their doors on the 22nd of February last year, and as of Friday, 121 whistleblowers are on our books, of which 103 need legal assistance. Counseling people needed, 43 people needed counseling because of the trauma they suffered, and 19 needed safety and security. These are real figures, these are real people, these are people with families. Let me quote to you something as chilling that has happened up last Thursday. The acting CEO of South African Tourism, Themba Khumalo, said, internal process in terms of the malicious leak, because this was confidential document that has resulted in a breach of employment relations and confidentiality clauses, will be carried out. And whoever the actor is, when he or she is found, will face the relevant remedies, he said. That is in the newspaper. What he actually said on TV is that the person need to be isolated. Now explain to me, what does isolated mean? Does that mean the person gets put in a corner, lose their life, lose their job? It is chilling when somebody on TV can say, we need to isolate the person that have leaked the information that could cost this country R1 billion. That is what this topic is about today, is the audacity on public TV to say somebody need to be isolated. And we can interpret isolate as much as we can. My panel today is Melanie, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Governor, Cynthia Stimple, who is a whistleblower herself, and then Tsepiso, ex-human rights, I took my glasses off, former Chief Executive Officer of the African Human Rights Commission. Cynthia, will you get us going?
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone for being here today. To all the organizers, thank you, and to all the attendees. I hope we can create the interest and support for whistleblowers from this forum. In Paul Pretoria's earlier session, he stated about the trends of the current corruption, where one is seeing sabotage, assassination, and the continuous dysfunctionality. When one looks at the thread around that, is the information that we're getting into the media space or as citizens of this country is through whistleblowers. My talk to you today is about the experience of whistleblowers. Okay. To change the slide. So whistleblowing is, no one wakes up to decide to be a whistleblower. It happens only because you, in your job, in your sphere that you're working in, or your experience in your profession, you find that things aren't going right. And you decide to speak to your colleagues or to your seniors and saying, this is going against our policies and procedures. And hence, how can we stop it and how can we fix it? So we do take it to our immediate circles, and we then take it to the more senior levels, and eventually, because no one is listening, one takes it outside. And that's when we came to the definition of whistleblowers. Many people have various definitions of what it entails to be a whistleblower. They call us many names. We are snitchers. We are impimpes. We are people who aren't following the protocol. You're supposed to keep quiet if you know something. And then you are ostracized once you speak out. So let's go to the definitions. In the PDA, the Actual Protected Disclosures Act of 2000 and amended 2017 legislation that we have in South Africa, it does not even define the name whistleblowing. The Transparency International, who is a German-based anti-corruption organization, they define it as follows: the disclosure of information related to corrupt, illegal, fraudulent, or hazardous activities being committed in or by public or private sector organizations, which are of concern and they threaten the public interest. And this is to individuals or entities believed to be able to effect this action. So they say that. The next definition comes from the International Labour Organization, and they define it further as saying the reporting by employees or former employees of illegal, irregular, or dangerous practices by employers. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines whistleblower as an individual who, without authorization, reveals private or classified information about an organization, usually related to the wrongdoing or the misconduct. Whistleblowers generally state that such actions are motivated by a commitment to public interest. And there we have it in this definition that the case that Ben Theron has just mentioned about the recent Tottenham Hotspur's procurement transaction. There's no discussion of we are doing the wrong thing, how should we be spending the money, where the money should best fit in this country, but rather that CEO is saying, we've got to find that whistleblower, we've got to hound him out, and we're going to hold him to account for disclosing supposedly confidential information. Further definitions regarding a whistleblower is that these terms were first used in early years around either mismanagement in government or through wastage and corruption. And it covers any activity now that which affects public officers or a public entity or private organizations. And this is more about the public interest, where it could result in wastage, in corruption, in fraud, or any self-seeking or profit-seeking, as we would call it. So to mention a few whistleblowers on the international global scale, which you may know of, Daniel Ellsberg, who was the whistleblower where they called him Deep Throat, Watergate. Then Edward Snowden, he whistleblew on the NSA and the CIA, who were getting young, savvy people, technological people in to build systems where they firstly told them that they should build the systems for spying on China, but the systems were actually used to spy on the people in their own country, in the USA. So you can imagine if the USA is doing it and China is doing it, what is happening in our country at present. And then Mark Felt, Chelsea Manning, Catherine Gunn, who came across an email. If you've ever watched her story, Official Secrets, where she came across an email where the discussion was happening about the Gulf War. And they were trying to hide that information, and she realized this was something wrong and she needed to do something about it. And then John Chitongo, Kenya, who took a position in government, in an anti-corruption department that was formed to prevent corruption, and yet corruption continued. And he did something very brave, where he taped his entire body with recording machines, wore this jacket, and he attended these meetings to record all the corruption discussions. When he tried to, initially when he tried to challenge it, he realized that they are still going to go on unabated. And that's when he started recording the information, which he took to London. In South Africa, we have many, and I could not even name them on this list, more for time that we're constrained with. Martha Nangoya, who recently won her award from the PROSA, and her the board of PRAS is still deciding on it. And then others like Masilo, Matepo, Ethel Williams, Suzanne Daniels, Bianca Goodson. What is the lived experience of a whistleblower? There are many. We are ostracized in society. We are continuously harassed. There's spreading of rumors. There's threats and reprimands. You are threatened your life, your job, your families, your children. We are blocked in many ways from getting new jobs. You cannot take a transfer, or you cannot apply for a new job. You are blacklisted because you're unable to work, and therefore you suffer with a bad credit record. And many of us have lost our lives. The ones who have lost our lives recently, Babita Deokaran, who's been mentioned, Pena Moreau, and more recently, a few others in our country of the Abatlali, Machanzongo area. What lessons have we learned from whistleblowing? And this is why there's been many webinars and discussions around what can we do to assist whistleblowers and support them if they are constantly being treated as pariahs and there's a stigma attached to them, and that many people do not want to hire them. I was recently invited to speak on the radio a week ago asking why is that whistleblowers cannot get jobs. And it's because they are treated in the manner and that society still has a stigma against them. But in our recent Zondo report, he's come up with quite a number of key recommendations, and so has many other organizations like PLAF and Corruption Watch and PARI. And I've just put them all together. What have we learned and how can we then encompass them into our legislation and into our social environment? The one is by creating an independent whistleblower regulatory authority, like an ombudsman, where everyone can bring their complaints there and they manage there, and they done in a manner that the whistleblower's anonymity is protected. Their name should not be out in the media, where people can judge them and where people can then find methods of attacking them. Then adopting a strict and obligatory timetables for processing and acting on the protected disclosures. We need to amend the Protected Disclosures Act sooner than later. I think it was earlier when Ian Fallon said, or it was Professor Kachalia, it's yesterday. There isn't time. We need to do it now. We need to establish punitive sanctions for breaches of the PDA. Currently, this is not in place. So board members, executive members who are in organizations who are going undeterred victimizing whistleblowers, they are not being attended to. Providing full legal immunities to whistleblowers. Then changing labor legislations and regulations for that, and to allow a fair remedy. So it means one needs to investigate first before you attack the whistleblower and for them to lose their jobs. So the Protected Disclosures Act states that there should be no occupational detriment. But that's the first action that is taken to all whistleblowers. And here we need to use that time and effort to make sure that if we're going to be fair, it's to allow that I'm almost done. Thank you. Allow that the investigations are done first before judgment is done. Then we need to establish mechanisms of safeguarding whistleblowers' physical safety as well as their mental and physical health. So from a safety perspective, we've seen that whistleblowers are threatened and have been killed. From a mental health perspective, just doing all the work we're doing with Whistleblower House and from all stories of people having published their own books, that whistleblowers have suffered a traumatic experience. And with that, they do need counseling. This needs to be built into the legislation because it's not there. And then There needs to be protection for the families and for their colleagues and for their societies. And there needs to be the financial support. And here the recommendation we have is that to create a whistleblower support fund, whereby monies are put in there to support whistleblowers in their individual right and what they need. Because the recent stories that broke out about Martha Pello More is she's lost everything. Many others like Dr. Masimba Dawa have lost their homes. They are unable to ever work and have a decent home to live in. So the Whistleblower Fund is supposed to support all these needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Malini Governor is the regional head specialized crime unit in the Western Cape. And I'm hoping in a talk, she'll just cover the difference between a whistleblower and a witness, because sometimes we use the words interchangeably and it's not necessarily true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and to my esteemed colleagues on this panel. I think we must give tribute to whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are key in any fight to anti-corruption. What's very clear is this piece of legislation that we use to protect or deal with whistleblowers has as its aim to create a culture in which will facilitate the disclosure of information. However, we've seen that this is anything but what it is sought to achieve. So we can accept, and it's welcomed that our Minister of Justice called this an outdated piece of legislation. Within this context, one needs to understand that we need to ensure that there is much wider protection and much wider leeway given to whistleblowers with lesser restrictions on what it is that they can disclose and the circumstances under which they can disclose. That's as a starting point. And I start with this primarily because it feeds in directly into what Prof. Feroz Kachalia started with. The aim is to deal with systemic corruption. The aim is to change how the whole of society addresses corruption. And with accepting that your starting point is to create this culture where people are free to speak about their experiences, what it is they viewed and what it is that they've experienced within the work environment, is critical to us detecting corruption. Now, international studies and specifically work that is done within the OECD space dealing with corruption and specifically corruption where foreign bribery is concerned. So this is companies in countries that domestically seem to be completely on par when it comes to having a great anti-corruption agenda and not having their public officials being corrupted, but their companies go into other jurisdictions and in those other jurisdictions end up corrupting public officials in order to get huge contracts and lots of profits as a result. What was seen by the OECD is that self-reporting and whistleblowing were the greatest detectors of corruption. The trend was that you'd see that when self-reporting started becoming a trend, there was a drop with whistleblowing. But prior to self-reporting getting this high levels of detection, you saw that whistleblowing was where critically the detection came from. Now, what that did was change the way in which those countries dealt with corruption, the way in which companies dealt with corruption. So they got ahead of the corruption by self-reporting rather than waiting for whistleblowers. And that tells you what the potential is that we have. So if we are in a space and place to ensure that we deal with our whistleblowers more effectively, we'll be in a space where we can actually ensure that we change the narrative where it comes to corruption, especially where companies are concerned. Ms. Simple has dealt with all the challenges that there are and what we need in terms of the legislation. What clearly from our side is, and to support the Zondo Commission recommendation, an independent agency. What we've seen in practice is that there's a severe level of distrust internally to report. People accept that the minute they report internally, it's guaranteed that they will be victimized. And I think just about every instance that we've seen in the playing out in the public space speaks to this being a real fear, a reality that whistleblowers are dealing with. The next aspect is they don't necessarily want to come and testify in respect of the matters. So this is the difference that you have between witnesses and whistleblowers. Whistleblowers give you information. They give you information which should be investigated, verified, and acted upon. Our current legislation does not put any obligation on an employer to investigate allegations that whistleblowers have raised. So they can do exactly what it is that we've seen, violate the act, and at the end of the day, victimize these persons. So this information going to an independent agency that deals with the investigation of the preliminary aspects of the allegations, and then at a very early stage involves law enforcement. We've heard the issue of collaboration, cooperation. Now, when you're dealing with something like corruption, the early identification of the matter and parallel investigations are critical to us turning around the long timelines that there are for investigations. So you need to have that in place with whatever it is that we decide to do and how we craft this entire whistleblowing regime. Having ensured that there is this process, and currently just to tell you how we in the short term have addressed this. So you'll find whistleblowers not wanting to report internally, but they are prepared to come in many instances to law enforcement and sometimes even to us in the NPA. Now in the NPA, dealing with matters in the Specialized Commercial Crime Unit, we do not have investigative powers. But we do partner very effectively with the SIU, and we partner with the Public Protector's Office. So we ensure that we create that safe environment for that witness, for that whistleblower to be in a position to go through to the Public Protector's Office or the SIU and facilitate that interaction. And I think the best example that we saw of the role that law enforcement, whistleblowing, and investigation of this can play is what happened during COVID. With SIU having the proclamation upfront relating to PPEs, people felt a lot more freer to go to SIU with disclosures. And as a result of such disclosures, they were able to immediately act upon it rather than waiting for a proclamation. So they were able to act on it. And as a result, we saw a lot more cases coming into our space for us to be able to deal with the procurement PPE fraud a lot more effectively. So having said that we need this type of relationship that is in place, we have to then also accept that whistleblowers should not, or you should build your investigation around the information that we receive rather than make whistleblowers witnesses. A witness is a person that testifies in court. They give a statement under oath. In some instances, because in order to protect their identity, we will withhold the identity of the witness until the time that they testify. A whistleblower is somebody that will give information, and it's not dissimilar to the informant systems. We currently have the informant system with those huge budgets in the police service, which allow informants to be rewarded for positive information that they give. And yet with our whistleblowers, we do not have a similar system in place. So that's another aspect that we need to start looking with our legislation and our architecture around whistleblowers. So with a positive result, whether it's a finalization of the case or a finalization of an investigation, there should be some incentive to at the end of the day, allow these persons to get on with their lives, especially in instances where they have been victimized for coming forward with these allegations. Now, in them coming forward with these allegations, with them being victimized and losing their jobs, we currently expect them in terms of the new legislation to actually approach a court. Litigation is expensive. If you cannot, like Ms. Moray, provide the roof over your head and for your children, how do we expect them to litigate? So whatever legislation we put in place, whatever architecture we have, has to address what the impact is on whistleblowers. I think the last aspect that we need to ensure where it comes to whistleblowers and why this independent agency is so necessary for us is to ensure that whistleblowing does not become politically weaponized, which is another aspect that we are seeing happening in the space. And this is especially so in the municipalities. Now, if you look at Protected Disclosures Act, it covers disclosures to cabinet members, it covers disclosures to provincial MECs, but it's completely silent as to where somebody in a municipality should be going when they, at the end of the day, detect fraud or corruption. So the independent agency, once again, or independent authorities such as SIU, the Public Protector's Office, is the best place for us to be looking at having the system working. So one of the things that we can actually do in our awareness is encourage whistleblowers to make use of these entities. One of the challenges that we have in the system is the proliferation of agencies, the proliferation of spaces and places that people can report to, that as a result, it creates confusion when somebody is dealing with a complaint and they want to go somewhere when they know that they cannot deal with it internally. So we need to see how best we harness where the best practices are. Currently, whilst we're waiting for the agency, whilst we are waiting for a new piece of legislation to deal with this. And I think our message has to be, use the independent agencies. Use the agencies that have got investigative powers to be able to go into an environment and investigate the allegations that are made. We need then also to ensure that if a matter cannot be proved any other way except through the evidence of the whistleblowers, that room is created for these whistleblowers to come into our witness protection program. The reality is that when you approach whistleblowers, they're not interested in getting into the witness protection program because they do not want to testify. And we have to respect that. Oftentimes, they may not be the best witness to testify, and we should not be creating a situation where whistleblowers have to understand that the minute you start making an allegation, that it automatically follows that there is testimony and your statement has to be obtained. So let us craft that way, and from us in law enforcement, we've tried to see, especially here in the Western Cape, how it is we craft our investigations around that. But ultimately, you find that the starting point is, do you want to go into witness protection? Obviously, that is the best option with any person that is to be a witness in a matter. In the sense of whistleblowers, you can also go into witness protection if they at any stage are subject to a disciplinary inquiry. And if they feel that as part of any of those processes, they are going to be, their livelihood is, or their lives are going to be subject to threat, their families are going to be subject to threat, that's an option that's available to them. I think that ultimately, if we do not get this right, this first step right in changing the culture, that anything that we put in place thereafter is that much more difficult. But if the starting point is that whistleblowers have a space, place, and are exalted in our communities rather than being punished, as we've heard, it changes the culture automatically. People start being a lot more observant of their conduct and ensuring at the end of the day that they toe the line as well. Companies then start dealing with things differently. They understand that they have to, that if they don't come forward first and foremost to deal with detecting, preventing, and also most importantly, reporting, that somebody else is going to do it. And if we have achieved one thing, we've achieved a lot in just this one aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Malini. Jaliso, over to you.
Thank you. Is it on? Hello? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. My input was going to be around how we create a conducive environment for whistleblowers in our country. But I do want to concur with what my colleagues have said on this topic. So I will not repeat many of the things which they have said. I was just reminded what was said more than 22 years ago by the late Arthur Chaskelson in the case of South African Association of Personal Injury Lawyers versus Heath and others. He said briefly, if allowed to go unchecked and unpunished, corruption and maladministration will pose a serious threat to our democracy. That was many, many years ago. And it looks like we never listened, because at this point in time, this country is dying due to corruption and maladministration, ESCOM, potholes all over the show. And yet, when we talk about measures to fight corruption, certainly whistleblowing is one of the most effective ways in which we can deal with corruption. But since the act was passed in 2000, as colleagues have pointed out, we have seen systematic victimization of whistleblowers in all forms. And then you start wondering, what does it say? Are we confused? Are we mad or what? On one hand, we talk about democracy, government for the people, by the people, for the people. We talk about fighting corruption. And yet, those who are at the forefront of fighting corruption are victimized, not just by ordinary people, but by the state using public resources, and by officials who've taken an oath that they will protect the people of this country. And therefore, victimization, apart from its negative impacts on the fight against corruption, it's also a violation of human rights. So where are those who are meant to protect human rights in our country as we speak, as far as the whistleblowers are concerned? So there's definitely a lot of work which needs to be done. I just want to mention one of the things which really saddens me about the victimization of whistleblowers is the lack of support. Many of them, when they get victimized, they have to fight their own cases, whether it's CCMA or labor court, which takes sometimes 3, 4 years, 5 years before people can get justice. Look at the SARS case. Colleagues were fired in SARS. They spent 5 years at home. They win the case, SARS appealed. It was only when some of us intervened that actually SARS apologized to those people and took them back. It's one of the biggest state agencies victimizing whistleblowers in the name of what? So, whilst at the commission, we've had to go to court to defend whistleblowers, spending millions of taxpayers' money in court. We win sometimes, we don't even get costs. And basically, this shows that we as a state, as a republic, we are confused as far as our understanding of the role of whistleblowing and its importance and what should be done to protect whistleblowers. So we have made it very clear, the act is outdated. It's a very useful act, but silly act in other ways, because it only confines whistleblowing in that sense to those who are employed and those who are consultants. What about ordinary South Africans? Someone who's running a spaza shop. What happens if you see corruption? Where do you go? Where do you get protected? And 22 years later, we have not even done much. Now we hear, of course, that the Minister of Justice, thanks God, will be submitting a proposal by end of April this year to see how the legal framework could be amended. That's great. But guess what? There's been very little consultation between us who are involved with civil society and government. I'm excluding you, Prof, that we have met with NACEC, but where is the state? Why is there no consultation between us as citizens of this country and government about things which really matter to us as a republic? So that's something which has to stop. So in the little time I have, let me just rush quickly towards because I also talk about short-term interventions and long-term interventions. So as far as short-term interventions are concerned, we demand the following, and I'm glad my colleagues from Public Service Commission are here. We want an immediate end of victimization by whistleblowers by organs of state and state officials. It's happening day in, day out. And we never understand this. We know the Public Service Commission did a study in 2014 and raised some of these concerns. But again, that report is gathering dust somewhere. And we really fail to understand what must we do then as citizens to stop the victimization of whistleblowers by the state using our taxes to protect the republic and to fight against corruption. And yet we must listen here on TV saying, well, comrades, we're fighting corruption, we'll do everything to fight corruption. And yet the very same people who talk about that are the ones who are victimizing whistleblowers or turning a blind eye to the victimization of whistleblowers. We also want financial legal support for whistleblowers who are challenging their victimization in courts and tribunals. Many colleagues who have gone to the CCMA spent billions of rands in legal fees. We took the case of Mr. Obilana to court. He was a teacher whistleblowing about sexual harassment by teachers in Mpumalanga. He gets fired, wins a case to be reinstated. Government, guess what? Appeals. So we took up the cases commission. We lost in the labor court. We paid a couple of million rands. We then appealed to the Labor Court of Appeal. And last year, September, October, when I left the commission, I was told the judge presidents advised our client to settle because government will take this matter to constitutional court and there's no money. So Mr. Bilana is still staying at home. 5 years later, no job, nothing, as we speak. We took the case of Mr. Zulu to court, witness protection. We sued the president and the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Police. We won, we didn't get cost. Mr. Zulu was put in witness protection, he ran away. Still in hiding up until now, despite being shot over 40 times as a witness to the killing of Mr. Councillor, ANC Youth League Councillor some time ago in Pietermaritzburg. So those are some of the issues which we're talking about, the victimization of whistleblowers. Number 3, would like to see the Chapter 9 institutions, including my own commission, really playing a greater role in supporting whistleblowers who are being victimized by the state or anybody else. Public Protector, Human Rights Commission. Most of the people we meet, they say, well, when they take matters to the Public Protector, they'll be told, no, this matter falls under CCMA or Labor Court. Human Rights Commission, the same story. We battled in the commission to take Mr. Bilana's case to court because we're told it's a labor court and we don't deal with labor matters. That's nonsense. It's a human rights issue. But you can imagine how many cases have these two bodies taken up to fight for whistleblowers who are being victimized by the state or by private sector. And number 4, we would like to see greater media campaigns by GCIS and SABC on the need and importance of whistleblowing in the country. We don't see it. And yet, we know as South Africans, the moment we are able to mobilize our people against a just cause, we can see a difference. So we need to get this country burning with support for whistleblowers, with whistleblowing against corruption, because corruption is killing our country. We're losing over 50 billion rands a year due to corruption. That's why there are no schools, no health hospitals, potholes, but at the same time, we are not tackling or tapping on those resources where our people can really get involved. 4, there must be support for civil society organizations which are supporting the work of whistleblowers. Many of us do this work from our pockets. Cynthia, Whistleblower House, and many others. Very little support, but we still do it. And colleagues will be aware that for the past 1 year, these colleagues here have been raising the profile of witness protection. That's why today we're sitting here. It's been us with very little support from government. So, and yet, year after year, many government resources are sent back to Treasury because they've not been used, or they get used elsewhere. I won't talk about space. I was told I should skip away from space. Then there's also a need really for an urgent engagement between Department of Justice and whistleblowing organizations. PDA falls under Department of Justice, but in the past 20 years, or let me not say that, past 2 years, we have not seen any engagement between ourselves and the department. We've written letters to say, can we talk? Nobody talks to us. And then you start wondering, why? Did we forget what Arthur Chapman said? That corruption threatens our democracy. So if we're so concerned about these things, then what are we doing? The 4th one is that we really would like to see some understanding or appreciation of whistleblowing by the judiciary. When we passed PEPUDA, there's a requirement in PEPUDA that no presiding officer should sit over a quality matter without being trained. And yet, when our people appear in courts for whistleblowing, they're told, sorry, we don't understand. It's actually quite sad. There have been a few court cases, of course, like the Cyrus one, where the judge said, well, this is whistleblowing and whistleblowers must be protected. But guess what? Most of the time when you go in CCMA or labor court, they don't care about whistleblowing. They're concerned about the matter at hand. You've been fired. Full stop. And we need to address this. So if our judiciary and lawyers could also understand that when someone says I'm a whistleblower, everything must stop until you address that issue. But hang on, we don't do that. We get victimized. Yeah. Now on medium-term issues, do you have 2 minutes? Okay. On medium-term issues, we certainly support the amendment of the PDA. Actually, we have drafted a model law for whistleblowing, which we hope government will consider. We need a much more holistic legal framework, which will address and encourage whistleblowing. It also includes incentives. I'm glad you talked about, the budget given by the police for informers. They get paid lots of money, but we're not even paying whistleblowers for fight for exposing corruption. Why not? So again, how do you reconcile these two? It's okay for informants to go and be paid by the police for spying on crime, on criminals. But when whistleblowers expose corruption, nothing happens to them. They don't even get paid, they actually get punished. So in some countries, there is incentive. So if we were to look at the amount of savings which we have had through whistleblowing, and yet we don't even give them a cent, I mean, that's crazy, with due respect. There's therefore a need for a special fund by government with the support of private sector to support whistleblowing in all the aspects. We've had community policing, we fund it. Why do we have community policing? Why do we have informers? But nothing for whistleblowing. I mean, that's silly. Then, of course, there is a need for the creation of some independent body which will address. Of course, there'll be a debate around this, Chapter 9 or whatever. But at this point in time, we're saying there are Chapter 9 bodies for the past 20 years or even more. We don't see their role in supporting of whistleblowers. So if they cannot play that role, despite all talks and stuff like that, then maybe there must be a reform of these bodies so they can actually play a greater role. And therefore, maybe we do need another body which can basically be much more sensitive to the issues at hand. Number 4, the AG. At least now with my experience in government, every year, organs of state must comply with the legal compliance reports to the AG about how they're complying with the legislation which applies to them. But guess what? Very few government departments talk about how they comply with PDA in their legal compliance reports. So the AG must also look into this thing and ask these questions. Number 5, we would love to see the Department of Justice producing an annual report on PDA. What are we doing with whistleblowing? Where are they? What's happening to them? And what needs to happen? And this report must be discussed in Parliament. We demand a parliamentary debate on whistleblowing if we are serious about fighting corruption. Thank you.
Let me challenge one of the points you made at the end here that says a special fund must be made available. Who will manage the special fund? And if you look at, previous speakers spoke about Chapter 9 institutions being repurposed. If you look at the SAPS safe houses that are being abused financially, money gets siphoned off. Where will that special fund lie in your mind?
Well, the talk is that, in view of everything you have mentioned before, that we should be very careful how we set up this panel and this fund. It definitely has to be, managed by people who are independent across public and private, and it must be funded by both government and the private sector. But certainly, in view of the experiences, we should make sure we have very good mechanisms to ensure that there's no capture. There's also accountability to this fund. There must be full transparency because it's actually for the people of this country, and not see this fund meeting some of the same fates which other funds have experienced before due to corruption and abuse and capture and all sorts of ills. Thanks.
A question to the panel. would an informal ombud for whistleblowers using retired judges established immediately to bridge the legislative gap and hiding the identity of whistleblower preserving confidentiality work? The panel, no particular person.
Let me start there on that one. Look, something urgent has to be done. And that has been our concern, that, we don't know how long the amendments of laws will take. This country has had a history of taking forever to pass laws. And therefore, while we support a much more holistic legal framework, but something has to happen now. And therefore, that kind of a measure which, can be in the interim, it could work. A retired judge helping, that's fine. But we basically want anything viable which will help the plight of whistleblowing and also help us to fight corruption in a much more effective manner, while still waiting for the long-term measurements which will take place. We don't even know when. Even, for example, the minister was supposed to come up with a bill at the end of April, which we haven't seen. How long will that take to go through Parliament?
So I think the important part is whatever it is that we decide to develop, it has to be something that first and foremost is in a position to ensure the protection of these whistleblowers, but not only protect the whistleblowers, be in a position to ensure that aspects are effectively investigated. So with having an informal ombud, we need to ensure that the measures that are in place in order to access law enforcement and or agencies such as SIU or the public protector are in place through that relationship in order to ensure that we get the benefits of the whistleblowing occurring. The next aspect would be, what would the role, function, and duties of that ombud be? That ombud would have to have teeth. That ombud would have to be in a position to issue out sanctions against private companies or government departments where there's been a breach of the whistleblower confidentiality or any aspects in respect of the Act. So in crafting it, in saying that it's an informal ombud, those types of aspects need to be spoken of. So perhaps what we actually need is, like we had with the Zondo Commission, we had the president who at the end of the day had the terms of reference that were put in place. So we create this ombud with clear terms of reference that cover these aspects for us to start ensuring that the current Act has the teeth and that there are sanctions in place to deal with any breaches.
Thanks. I just want to add that they must have the capability to investigate, like the Zondo Commission did. Thank you.
Malini, a question to you. Does self-reporting increase where NTRs or stronger law enforcement are in place? What is the incentive to self-report?
Well, let's first start. The first incentive to self-report should be that you are complying with your obligations in terms of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. Section 34 makes it an obligation at the pain of being sanctioned through criminal processes for failing to report. So any offense involving an amount over 100,000, and an employer or person in a position of authority is obliged to actually report where it involves offenses involving dishonesty. So that should be the first incentive. There is an obligation, a legal obligation, to ensure that companies are in fact reporting. Non-trial resolutions and the space where self-reporting becomes relevant where non-trial resolutions are concerned is that certainly should be the precursor. If you've done a self-report, it's much easier to deal with a non-trial resolution or a deferred prosecution with a company that has done the self-report as opposed to one that hasn't. One that decides to fight the entire process, does not want to admit their responsibility, liability, but rather at the end of the day expects the state to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt, as does occur. Now, you've seen this link between non-trial resolutions and incentives very effectively when one looks at the work that the Security and Exchange Commission of the US has done, and they publicize their results and the monies that are paid over to whistleblowers. It's actually publicized on their website. You can go onto it now and see what it is that they've done there. But part of the entire process for dealing with the non-trial resolution is if there has been a whistleblower report, how has that company dealt with whistleblowing? And certainly those are all factors that go towards addressing how that company should be dealt with. And if you have systems, processes in place, which by the way, there isn't an obligation on any company in this country at the moment, and certainly not in terms of the Protected Disclosures Act to ensure is in place. So compliance programs, anti-corruption compliance programs internationally require you to have a dedicated whistleblower program that speaks to how, in fact, you will deal with the whistleblower allegation when it occurs internally and what measures are put in place in order to ensure that there isn't victimization of the whistleblower. Those are the types of things that you will need in place for there to be an effective non-trial resolution with a company.
Could I have a comment for each of one of you? What does the panel think of public recognition of whistleblowers? For example, Babita Deokaran International Airport. Cynthia, starting with you.
Thanks. Whistleblowers should be recognized and acknowledged and rewarded. It's something that at least shows that what they've done it for the public good and the public interest. In the case of Babita Deokaran, who's left a daughter who's currently now first year university, I think, her family supporting her getting through university. There's nothing else. And what is the country doing about it? So yes, I recommend it fully, and it needs to be done on an annual basis. Thank you. With a monetary award. Thanks.
Thank you. Many years ago, I was walking in Times Square with my son. We passed a van, and an hour later, we had that van actually had a bomb. And a hawker saw the smoke coming out of the van and blew the whistle. So whistleblowers are very important. In our country, if the media could show how much savings have we gained through whistleblowing properly, the country will be amazed and shocked. And therefore, one of our requirements is that there must be a recognition of whistleblowing, and maybe even an international day for whistleblowers, and maybe even an award system where we can have awards for whistleblower of the year, people who have actually saved this country. In the past, those who fought for the Republic were treated as heroes and given awards. Nowadays, they get prison, they get fired, and they get victimized. Very crazy turn of events. So yes, we do need to recognize our whistleblowers much more effectively than we've been doing up until now. Thanks.
So it goes without saying, the more we exalt these heroes, the more we ensure that it becomes part of our DNA as a country, the more we will be able to be more effective in addressing corruption at the root level. If we change the culture of people, then certainly at the end of the day, the room higher up for corruption to thrive is limited or removed. So if you do not, at the end of the day, treat whistleblowers as the heroes that they are, we cannot change this perspective. So I'm all in favor of the recognition that should be given to these people. And I think that we need to ensure that we respect where they've come, what they've gone through, the struggles that they've gone through, but also at the end of the day, we need to publicize the successes that there have been as a result of what it is that they've done.
Ben, can I add one thing? Yeah, I mean, sorry, Cynthia, for saying this to you, but let's take Cynthia's case. Zondo says Cynthia was basically victimized as a whistleblower, and she lost over 2 million rands. We took up the case of the commission, it hasn't moved. And how does SA explain itself as we speak now? There's a report there, nothing has happened. Where's the Minister of Public Enterprise? Where's the CEO where's the board of SAA? Whistleblowers, victimization. Thank you.
How can legislation be affected to ensure a clear separation between politically deployed public representatives at all levels, while ensuring independent financial governance oversight structures established across the state and government? Separation of deployees, political deployees, party deployees, versus the management and the finance management of companies and the state?
So it's very clear that we speak about political will. So if we speak about the political will to address corruption, we should be looking at merit. We should be looking at merit, and we should also be looking at persons being employed into these positions who at the end of the day are accountable. If you have a system where there isn't the separation between the political persona and what your responsibilities and duties are, you are always going to find that the challenges that we have with addressing corruption effectively are not, in fact, able to be achieved. So we have to ensure that when we speak about having contracts, performance contracts that people are judged against, that at the end of the day, it's clear what those performance contracts are. It's clear what is in that and what it is that needs to be accounted for. And then we need to have an independent body to which we have this accountability. And currently we use Parliament, but Parliament needs to actually have the teeth and use their functions more effectively to hold people and entities accountable in that space.
I support the call by Public Service Commission that we need a much more professional and dedicated civil servants who are loyal to the Constitution and the Republic, not political parties. In the corporate sector, we also need people who are committed to the Republic, not the bottom line. And I think we were to create a culture could actually succeed. Just look at the issue of what do they call it now? Looting of our resources, cables and stuff like that. A lot of these things happen in full view of the people. But due to the lack of incentive of reporting this, even if they report, nothing happens. And we can basically change the culture by making sure that we are more committed to the Republic. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what does being a South African mean, whether in corporate sector or public sector?
Are financial incentives for whistleblowing not a double-edged sword, i.e. discrediting of whistleblower motives and encouraging frivolous complaints as opposed to full compensation?
So I don't believe that incentivizing this will in fact create the situation where you're going to be having frivolous complaints and the like. If you've got an independent agency, they will be very quickly able to root out where the truth lies and where it does not. But at least you'll have a space and place where at the end of the day, everything will be investigated and dealt with. And if you look at the US system, what happens is that the incentives are not paid upfront. The incentives happen on the successful finalization of the matter. So at the end of the day, whether it's part of a non-trial resolution or a criminal case that unfolds, or at the end of the day, finding the evidence to show that disciplinary steps need to be taken internally because mechanisms are not being followed, but there is a positive outcome. But where there's a positive outcome as a result of the information that is provided, then that aspect then kicks in the incentives. So, but having said that, you need an independent agency to investigate that. You need an independent agency to be in a position to deal with that. You can't have an incentive system where it lies internally for these things to be dealt with, because we've seen through practice how easily it can be dismissed, or even the information is given through internally and then a defense is almost built up to counter what the whistleblowers will in fact state.
I would say yes, it should be handled with care, but it's very important. As I was saying earlier on, if we keep on paying informers out of the police budget, why not paying whistleblowers in a management? Of course, we know what happened with Richard Mdluli and abuse of those monies, but surely we can address that. So yes, we have to incentivize whistleblowers because it's really important for what we want to achieve. Many people in this country get rewarded for fighting for the Republic except whistleblowers. So what is the difference? Whistleblowers from Mars and everywhere else is from Venus? Thanks.
Malini, I suspect you've answered this one, but I don't want to, in case it's something else. Noting Cynthia's point of protecting whistleblowers through anonymity, how would this impact the evidential value of the disclosure, specifically when taken up by SAPS or MPA?
Okay. So you heard me indicate that ideally you want to be able to have a parallel investigation. And if you treat a whistleblower who states to you very clearly, I do not want to testify, they are giving you information. So you treat the information exactly as you would in any other circumstance. And that is why I favor us using SIU or the Public Protector's Office. Because remember, we need a certain standard within SAPS or the NPA. There has to be information under oath before you can actually be in a position to register a criminal complaint. And if you cannot use the whistleblower as your witness, your A1 or the person who gives a statement under oath, you'll need to rely on the investigative powers of other agencies. So this is why you need to work closely with them. In that instance, we hand over to that agency, the SIU or Public Protector, because they do have investigative powers to be able to deal with information, and then using, and especially because the information relating to maladministration involving government departments in particular, they are in a position to go into those spaces and do the necessary investigations, gather the evidentiary material, and then present it to SAPS and the NPA for us to be able to take those cases forward. The challenge that you have is with the private sector. Now, what do we do with the private sector? And that's where that ombudsman that we're speaking about that has got investigative powers, or the use currently of CIPC. The Companies Act has probably the most powerful tools in place. And if you look at internationally, the SEC, the number of legislation that they actually deal with, Financial Conduct Sector Authority in the UK and other countries, where you've got this umbrella legislation that deals with companies, surely there should be an enforcement space where you can deal with something like this. So I'm saying that when we craft this, we need to see how we address the private sector more effectively as well, because currently I think we do have enough to deal with whistleblowers and the translation of information into evidence through the entities that are there. But certainly it is seriously lacking in the private sector.
Just briefly, there was discussions last year that the GSC should also have a whistleblower unit. I don't know how far they've gone, because certainly one discomfort one had with the Zondo Commission was as if state capture is confined largely to the public sector. It's happening big time in the private sector. Whistleblowing is also happening, victimizing is also happening there. So there's definitely a need for the private sector to, to get more involved in this matter. And I think that unit in the JSC, which will be focusing on whistleblowing in the corporate sector, will be quite a useful thing. So I'm hoping a prof there, Kachalia, will have a discussion with the corporate sector to see how can, JSC and other entities play a greater role in the support for whistleblowing, in view of the importance of whistleblowing in the fight against corruption and abuse of power in the country.
We have 3 minutes left, so just 2 questions. Do we have examples of whistleblowers in South Africa specifically, whether it's private or public sector, who have sued the state, successfully sued the state?
Not that I'm aware of, because it's been so hard. Many have had, the whistleblowers I've been working with, many have had a case to take forward and sue the state or sue major organizations like the banks, for instance. But their case is prescribed. The lawyers don't want to take their cases because they all, it's a conflict of interest. And so the poor whistleblower has to pick up the dregs of his life and start somewhere else. And so, yes, no one has done, not that I'm aware of yet. Thank you.
I could think of 2, Cynthia. One is the SARS case. I remember that that lady was a whistleblower because she opposed the restructuring of SARS through Bain, but then they won in the labor court, and then SARS wanted to appeal. They lost the appeal, and then they got reinstated. The other one we had was the one of Mr. Bilana, which we took as a commission. But then, unfortunately, when he got to labor court of appeal, he was told, settle, and he took a settlement of 10 months, and end of the story, because he could not afford to fight his case beyond that. Actually, we wanted to go to constitutional court to say, but it's unacceptable. How does government violate its own act? But unfortunately, there are very, very few successful cases that we know which have actually gone. And we're hoping at some point in time we'll end up at the constitutional court. Maybe then the court will clarify this area of law for everybody else.
We've run out of time. I just want to thank the panel. I think the topic is very lively. It is absolutely critical because if I look at the number of questions that this panel have received compared to the others, I think that this is a real live topic, relevant today, will become more relevant in the next few weeks and months, and it needs urgent attention. People's lives are at stake, and South Africa's future is at stake, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. That early Easter bunny present in your goodie bag, the Confronting the Corrupt book, has got an interesting passage in it about the experience in Schleswig-Holstein in Germany, where a retired police chief, or you could say in South Africa, a retired judge, is given the job simply by contract with the state. In other words, you could do a contract tomorrow with retired judges willing to do so, to be the ombud who interposes himself in any whistleblowing situation in which confidentiality and protection of identity is a prerequisite. And the way it works in Schleswig-Holstein is set out in the chapter on it, and it seems to be an informal solution to the problems of whistleblowers in South Africa that could be put in place immediately if the political will to address the issue could be generated. So don't miss that input from Wolfgang Pistol, who attended the first Cape Town conference on this topic of countering the corrupt. We now have a break for lunch. We return to where tea was served, and we reconvene at 10 to 2. I'm saying 10 to 2 because the people watching in cyberspace do not expect us to start before 2 o'clock. And so our next session, which is the session on NTRs, is scheduled for 2 o'clock. And just in case the majority of people in this webinar are expecting us to stick to the schedule that we've advertised, we've come back on schedule rather remarkably in this panel. And so we are going to be disciplined, and we are going to be in the room by 2 o'clock. There's plenty of time for lunch and plenty of time for discussion. And thank you for your attention. I did not see a single attendee fall asleep, which I suspect is a function of the efficiency of the air conditioning, as well as the quality of the panels we've had this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.